My name is Rebecca. I am 33 years old, and my own family just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. I was sitting behind the wheel of my beat-up 2015 Honda Civic, parked outside my parents' sprawling $1.2 million house in the Atlanta suburbs, when my phone buzzed against the cup holder. It was a text from my Aunt Carol. The message was short and strange. "I think you need to see this." She had sent it to the wrong group chat, and she would never know just how much that single mistake was about to change everything. I tapped the screen, and my blood ran ice cold. The video opened on my parents, Thomas and Brenda, standing in the middle of their massive custom kitchen. The marble countertops gleamed under the recessed lighting, completely buried beneath trays of expensive Thanksgiving catering. They were each holding a crystal flute filled with premium champagne, the bubbles catching the light like tiny gold sparks. Beside them stood my older sister, Samantha, and her husband, Terrence. Terrence is a sharp-dressed man who loves nothing more than playing the part of a high-rolling real estate mogul. In the video, he was wearing a flashy, perfectly tailored designer suit that probably cost more than my entire car was worth, casually adjusting his heavy gold cuffs while my sister gazed up at him with open adoration, as if he had personally hung the moon over their custom kitchen island. They were all laughing wildly, the kind of deep, unrestrained belly laughs you only ever share with people you completely and utterly trust. Then my father, Thomas, turned and looked directly into the camera, his face twisting into a cruel, satisfied sneer. "Rebecca is a pathetic failure," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "At 33, she's still doing freelance data entry out of some shoebox apartment. At least she makes Terrence look like a genius by comparison." The whole group erupted into laughter again, glasses clinking together in cheerful agreement. My mother, Brenda, took a delicate, unhurried sip of her champagne, rolled her eyes theatrically, and added, "Thank God for Apex Holdings paying off all our debts, because that girl has never been anything but useless." I sat frozen in the driver's seat of my freezing car and watched the video 3 more times, my thumb hovering over the replay button each time, as if some part of me needed to keep confirming it was real. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply smiled, a cold, hard, deliberate smile that felt strange stretching across my own face. Because you see, what my ungrateful parents and my arrogant brother-in-law did not know, what none of them had ever bothered to find out, was that I am the sole owner and CEO of Apex Holdings, LLC. I am the anonymous benefactor who quietly pulled them back from the edge of total bankruptcy 5 years ago. Before I continue telling you this story, let me know in the comments below where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your true worth, who mistook your silence for weakness instead of what it really was: control. Growing up in this family meant your value was measured entirely by the status you could provide. My parents worshipped appearances above almost everything else, so when they lost everything 5 years ago because of their own reckless spending, their country club memberships, their leased luxury cars, their endless remodeling projects, I could not bear the thought of watching them get thrown out onto the street. But I also understood something crucial. If I handed them my hard-earned money directly, with my name attached, they would treat me like a permanent open bank account, draining me dry year after year while still treating me like garbage in every other way that mattered. So instead, I used my background as a senior financial risk analyst to quietly build Apex Holdings from the ground up. I bought up their debt through layers of corporate paperwork. I anonymously covered their mortgage, their property taxes, and their utility bills through secure, untraceable corporate accounts. And to keep the peace, and to protect what was left of my own mental health, I played the role of the struggling, unremarkable freelance data entry clerk to absolute perfection. I drove this rusted-out Honda Civic. I lived in a tiny, unimpressive apartment on the wrong side of town. I wore thrift store clothes to their lavish family gatherings, smiling through every snide comment. I did all of it so they could keep their fragile pride intact, and so I could keep my own boundaries firmly in place. And how did they repay 5 years of my silent generosity? By using my carefully constructed fake poverty as a punchline to elevate Terrence, a man who had never once closed a legitimate real estate deal in his entire life. Terrence, who leased luxury cars and bought designer suits entirely on credit, while my company secretly kept a roof over both his head and my parents' heads, without either of them ever knowing it. The sheer audacity of it burned hot in my chest as I sat there in the cold. They were toasting to my supposed failure while drinking champagne bought inside a house I had personally paid for. My mother called me useless while standing under a roof secured entirely by my signature. My father called me pathetic while praising a man who was nothing more than a walking, talking illusion of wealth. I looked down at the steering wheel of my humble little car and felt a strange, profound sense of clarity settle over me. For years I had tolerated their sideways glances, the way they visibly sighed when I walked into a room, and their constant, unsolicited advice about how I really needed to get my life together. I had quietly absorbed every one of their financial burdens so they could sleep soundly at night in their custom sheets, only to discover that their favorite pastime, apparently, was mocking my supposed misery behind my back. And now, thanks to Aunt Carol's mistake, right in front of my own eyes. I locked my phone and slipped it into the pocket of my cheap winter coat. Today was Thanksgiving. I looked through my windshield at the massive double doors of their home, framed by tasteful seasonal wreaths and expensive fall decorations that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They thought they were untouchable. They genuinely believed that the mysterious Apex Holdings was just some faceless corporate angel that would keep funding their extravagant lifestyle forever, with no strings attached and no consequences waiting in the wings. I stepped out of my car, and the crisp November wind hit my face like a slap that somehow felt clarifying rather than harsh. I walked up the long paved driveway, my inexpensive boots crunching heavily against the immaculate gravel. I could hear the faint sound of smooth jazz music and boisterous laughter spilling out from the dining room windows. They were in there right now, celebrating a life they had never actually earned, mocking the very person who quietly held the deed to their comfort. I reached the front porch and stood before the heavy oak door for a long moment. I took one deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs completely, washing away the last remaining ounce of daughterly guilt I still possessed after all these years. I pressed the glowing doorbell. It was time to join the party and find out exactly how far they were willing to push the girl they thought had absolutely nothing left to lose. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the grand foyer. The air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey, expensive sage stuffing, and the overwhelming, cloying scent of my mother's signature designer perfume. The boisterous laughter I had heard from the driveway died instantly the moment my cheap boot squeaked against the polished marble floor. My Aunt Carol offered a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile from the hallway, clearly aware of what her mistake had unleashed, but the rest of the room simply stared in stunned silence. Thomas cleared his throat and adjusted the collar of his cashmere sweater, while Samantha blatantly looked me up and down, her eyes lingering with obvious disdain on the frayed cuffs of my generic winter coat. No one said, "Happy Thanksgiving." No one offered to take my coat. I hung it up myself and walked directly into the formal dining room, taking the only empty seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, my back straight, and my expression unreadable. Before I could even unfold my linen napkin, the attack began. There was no small talk about the weather, no polite inquiries about my health or my week. Terrence leaned across the table, his gold Rolex catching the light of the crystal chandelier hanging overhead. He did not pass me a plate of food. Instead, he slid a thick, glossy real estate brochure and a stapled stack of legal documents across the polished wood surface. The paper skidded to a stop right in front of my empty dinner plate. I looked down. It was a commercial loan application, complete with a signature line already highlighted in fluorescent yellow. I looked back up at Terrence, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "What is this?" I asked quietly. Terrence let out a condescending little chuckle, exchanging a knowing glance with my sister as if they had rehearsed this moment together. "It's a golden opportunity for you to finally pull your weight around here, Becca," he said, leaning back comfortably in his custom-upholstered chair like a man about to deliver good news. "I'm closing a massive deal on a luxury condo project downtown. Top-tier stuff, probably a little over your head, but the bank is playing hardball with the liquidity requirements. I'm exactly $50,000 short on the earnest money deposit. I just need a clean Social Security number to co-sign a short-term bridge loan." I stared at him, genuinely amazed by his sheer audacity. "You want me to take out a $50,000 loan for you?" I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Terrence scoffed and waved his hand dismissively, as though I had suggested something absurdly petty. "Don't act like it's some enormous ask. You have zero debt because you have zero assets. Your credit file is basically a ghost town. The bank will approve it based entirely on my projected collateral. Besides, what exactly do you have to lose? It's not like your freelance data entry gig is ever going to buy you a house. You live in a shoebox. This is your chance to actually contribute something to the family legacy instead of just showing up here to eat our food twice a year." I looked over at my father, half expecting him to intervene, to say something, anything, in my defense. Instead, Thomas was busy calmly carving the turkey, nodding along in easy agreement with Terrence's demands. "He's right, Rebecca," my father muttered without even looking up from the bird. "You've been floating through life doing absolutely nothing productive. Terrence is out there building an empire. The very least you can do is put your name on a piece of paper to help him secure this property." Samantha leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against the stem of her wineglass. "Honestly, Becca, it's incredibly selfish of you to even hesitate for a second," she said, her voice syrupy with false concern. "Do you have any idea how much this family has done for you over the years? I've been giving you my hand-me-down designer clothes for years now, just so you don't look like a complete vagrant every time you go to the grocery store. Terrence is offering to let you be part of something big for once. When the project pays off, maybe he'll even toss you a few $1,000s so you can finally upgrade that pathetic little car parked in our driveway." The sheer delusion in her voice was almost intoxicating to witness up close. She was wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that I had indirectly paid for the moment I covered their property taxes last spring, sparkling proudly under the chandelier as she lectured me about selfishness. Then came the final blow. My mother, Brenda, picked up her silver butter knife and tapped it sharply and deliberately against her crystal water goblet. The sharp, ringing sound silenced the entire table instantly. She fixed her cold, piercing eyes directly on me. "We are not having a debate about this, Rebecca," she said, her tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "You are going to pick up that pen. You are going to write down your Social Security number. And you are going to sign on the dotted line, right now, in front of all of us. This family is finally bouncing back after the bankruptcy, and I will not allow your stubborn, poverty-stricken mindset to hold Terrence back from something this important. You owe us for raising you. Now sign the paper so the rest of us can actually enjoy our dinner in peace." The silence in the room afterward was absolute. 5 pairs of eyes stared at me, expecting me to crumble the way I always had before, expecting the weak, compliant girl who kept her head down and her wallet open to simply obey without question. One more time. I looked down at the loan document laid out before me. I saw the blank space waiting for the guarantor signature. I looked at the glossy brochure filled with fake, computer-generated architectural renderings of a building that likely didn't even exist yet. Then, slowly, I reached out and picked up my crystal water goblet instead. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the ice-cold water, letting the silence stretch out even further. I set the glass back down gently, making absolutely certain it did not make a single sound against the wood. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I looked Terrence dead in the eye and offered him a pleasant, hollow customer service smile, the kind I used to give difficult clients on my worst days. "I don't think so," I said calmly. "Have a wonderful Thanksgiving." The collective gasp of shock that followed was like music to my ears, the first genuinely satisfying sound I had heard all night. "Wait, where do you think you're going?" my mother screeched, her carefully crafted, elegant facade shattering instantly into something far uglier. "Get back here right now, you ungrateful brat." I did not turn around. I walked out of the dining room, grabbed my cheap winter coat from the hallway hook without breaking stride, and walked right out through the heavy oak front door. The cold November wind hit me again, but this time it felt incredibly, almost impossibly refreshing, like stepping out of a burning building. I walked back down the long gravel driveway, ignoring the muffled shout still spilling out from inside the house behind me. I climbed into the driver's seat of my freezing Honda Civic and locked the doors out of sheer habit. I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. My hands, surprisingly, were perfectly steady. I opened my encrypted banking application, bypassing the standard login screen with my biometric security key. The screen loaded, revealing the massive 8-figure portfolio belonging to Apex Holdings LLC. I navigated calmly to the Automated Disbursements tab. There they all were, neatly listed, the scheduled monthly payments that had spent 5 years quietly keeping their perfect suburban illusion alive. The $4,000 mortgage payment, the $800 utility bundle, the landscaping fees, the country club dues. I selected the master file labeled simply Thomas and Brenda Residence. A warning prompt popped up on the screen, asking me to confirm the cancellation of all linked recurring transfers. I stared at the single word, confirm. I thought about the $50,000 loan application sitting next to my empty dinner plate. I thought about the video of them laughing at my expense over crystal flutes of champagne. Without a single ounce of hesitation, I pressed my thumb against the screen. The status bar flashed green. Autopay canceled. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, started the ignition, and drove calmly away from the $1.2 million house they were, unknowingly, already about to lose. 2 weeks passed in absolute blissful silence. I did not receive a single text message or voicemail from my parents or my sister. In their minds, I imagine, giving me the silent treatment felt like a severe and fitting punishment. They almost certainly assumed I was sitting alone in my tiny apartment, agonizing over my decision to walk out on Thanksgiving dinner, quietly waiting for the moment they would graciously allow me back into the fold. They had absolutely no idea that I was sleeping better than I had in 5 full years. The first financial tremor hit on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping black coffee and reviewing quarterly projection reports for my actual corporate clients, when my phone screen violently lit up beside my laptop. It was my mother. The caller ID flashed a photo of Brenda from last year's country club gala, draped in expensive pearls that I had, in a roundabout way, also indirectly paid for. I took a slow, unhurried sip of my coffee, let it ring 3 full times, and finally answered calmly. I did not even get the chance to say hello. "Rebecca, what kind of dark curse have you brought upon this family?" Brenda shrieked into the receiver. Her voice was shrill and echoing, laced with absolute panic, completely stripped of her usual refined country club composure. I held the phone an inch away from my ear. I am standing at the register inside the Gucci boutique at Phipps Plaza right now, she continued, breathless. Do you have any idea how completely humiliating this is? I just tried to buy one simple python leather handbag, and the cashier told me my premium platinum card was declined. Declined, Rebecca, in front of Diane and Susan, of all people. I listened to her hyperventilate, my face completely expressionless. I already knew exactly why her card had been declined. That platinum credit card was tied to a joint checking account that relied heavily, month after month, on cash infusions from Apex Holdings to cover its exorbitant, ever-climbing balances. When I canceled the autopay 2 weeks earlier, the account had dried up completely and quietly, without ceremony. Their automatic payments for luxury car insurance, country club dues, and high-end grocery deliveries had almost certainly triggered a rapid cascade of overdraft fees. The bank had simply cut them off without warning, exactly the way it cuts off anyone else who runs out of money. "Are you even listening to me?" my mother screamed, the sound of her frantic pacing clearly audible through the phone's speaker. The sales associate looked at me like I was some kind of street beggar. She actually had the nerve to ask if I had another form of payment. Me. I am the chair of the annual charity gala, and this little retail worker asked me for a backup card. This is all your fault, you ungrateful little wretch. I set my coffee mug down gently on the counter. My fault? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. How exactly is your maxed-out credit card my fault, Mother? Because you carry this disgusting poverty mindset wherever you go, she spat back venomously. Ever since you selfishly walked out on Thanksgiving and refused to help Terrence with his real estate project, everything has been going wrong. Your father's business accounts are suddenly frozen. The mortgage portal says our payment was returned. You brought this bad karma into our lives. You are a black cloud, Rebecca. You infect everyone around you with your cheap, low-class energy. If you had just signed that piece of paper like a good daughter would, the universe would not be punishing us right now. You need to wire me $3,000 immediately so I can pay for this bag and salvage my reputation. Go to a payday loan place if you absolutely have to. I stared at the blank wall of my apartment, letting her insane, self-serving logic wash over me like white noise. She was standing inside a luxury boutique holding a python skin handbag she absolutely could not afford, demanding that her supposedly impoverished daughter take out a predatory loan just to save her fragile social standing. It was, honestly, the purest possible distillation of their family's complete financial incompetence, all crystallized into one phone call. I did not yell back. I did not bother trying to explain that Apex Holdings had already quietly cut the cord weeks ago. Let the universe take the credit a little while longer, I decided. I took a deep breath and spoke directly and clearly into the microphone. Put the bag back on the shelf, Mother, I said coldly, and don't ever call me to fix your messes again. Before she could utter another screeching syllable, I pressed the red button and ended the call. I tossed the phone onto the counter and watched it light up and vibrate seconds later as she desperately tried to call back, again and again. I simply muted the device. The silence that returned to my apartment felt thick and, somehow, incredibly peaceful. But the morning was far from over. Less than 10 minutes after I hung up on Brenda, my secure encrypted laptop chimed with a high-priority notification. I opened the Apex Holdings administrative dashboard. A flashing red alert immediately dominated the center of the screen. It was a notice from the Commercial Auto Lending Division of a major national bank, detailing a severe delinquency on a commercial lease for a brand-new luxury Range Rover. The primary lessee was a shell corporation registered directly to Terrence. I clicked into the digital file and smiled to myself. When Terrence had originally leased that $100,000 vehicle to help maintain his phony image as a wildly successful real estate investor, his personal credit had been far too damaged to actually secure the loan on his own merits. So he had manipulated my father into asking Apex Holdings to quietly act as a silent corporate guarantor. Since I had still been playing the role of the family's benevolent anonymous savior at the time, I had authorized the guarantee just to keep the peace and avoid another round of family drama. The lease payments were supposed to be automatically drafted from Terrence's business account every single month. The dashboard now displayed the brutal, undeniable truth. Terrence's account showed non-sufficient funds. His massive monthly payment had bounced entirely, and because I had already severed the financial lifeline running to my parents' accounts, they could not quietly bail him out this time either. The banking system was now formally asking Apex Holdings, as the official guarantor, to cover the $2,000 monthly payment in order to prevent the vehicle from sliding into total default. Terrence, it turned out, was an absolute fraud from top to bottom. His designer suits, his luxury SUV, his arrogant lectures about building a real estate empire. It was all built on a foundation of sand, funded entirely and invisibly by my own silent, unappreciated generosity. And now, finally, the tide was rushing back in. The bank system presented me with two clean, clickable options. The first was to authorize the transfer and quietly cover Terrence's missed payment, just as I always had before. The second was to officially decline the guarantor intervention, which would immediately breach the lease contract and send the entire file straight to the bank's asset recovery division. I thought about the Thanksgiving table. I thought about Terrence demanding my social security number while mocking my tiny apartment and telling me, to my face, that I had zero assets. I thought about my sister Samantha laughing at my frayed winter coat while wearing diamonds I had essentially paid for myself. I moved my digital mouse over the second option. I clicked decline. A bright green checkmark appeared instantly, confirming that Apex Holdings was officially and permanently washing its hands of the lease. The contract was nullified on the spot. The Range Rover was no longer legally his to drive. The vehicle was now officially flagged for immediate repossession. The dominoes were falling faster than I had even anticipated, and I fully intended to enjoy watching every single one of them crash to the ground. I closed the laptop, letting a deep, quiet satisfaction settle into my chest. But the peaceful quiet of my morning was abruptly shattered moments later. A violent, rhythmic pounding echoed suddenly through my small living room. Someone was hammering their fists against my front door, aggressively rattling the cheap brass deadbolt in its frame. I glanced at the digital clock on my microwave. It was barely noon. I walked over to the peephole and looked through the scratched glass. Terrence and Samantha were standing out in the narrow, dimly lit hallway of my apartment building. Terrence looked absolutely enraged, his face flushed a deep, angry red, while Samantha stood just behind him with her arms crossed tightly, a look of utter disgust plastered across her perfectly contoured face. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open. Before I could even say a single word, Terrence shoved his way past me, stepping right onto my faded entryway rug in his expensive Italian loafers as though he owned the place. "What the hell is wrong with you, Becca?" Terrence barked, his voice booming uncomfortably loud in my small, cramped space. "Are you completely devoid of any human empathy? My parents-in-law are sitting in their kitchen right now practically in tears. Their mortgage payment just bounced. Every single utility bill they have was returned for non-sufficient funds. That anonymous benefactor who's been keeping them afloat for years just randomly pulled the plug, and they're completely panicking." I stood by the open door, keeping my posture relaxed and my face carefully impassive. "Oh," I said simply. "That sounds incredibly stressful." Terrence threw his hands up in the air, his heavy gold Rolex flashing aggressively even in the poor lighting of my apartment. "Stressful? It's an absolute disaster." "And where exactly were you when Brenda called you crying this morning? You hung up on her. You hung up on your own mother while she was having a massive financial crisis. You are honestly the most selfish person I have ever met in my life. They are drowning, and you're just sitting here in this dump doing nothing. You need to go straight to your bank, drain whatever pathetic savings account you have, and wire them the cash to cover the mortgage today. It is the absolute least you can do after ruining our Thanksgiving dinner and refusing to help me with my business loan. Samantha stepped into the doorway, refusing to actually cross the threshold into my apartment, as if the space itself were somehow contagious. She looked around slowly at my modest living room, sneering openly at my secondhand sofa, the simple bookshelf, and the small, basic television set. Honestly, Becca, I don't know how you live in this roach motel, Samantha said, her eyes scanning the cracked paint on the ceiling and the worn, thinning carpet with undisguised contempt. It smells like cheap cooking oil and failure in here. You have literally nothing going for you. No assets, no husband, no real career to speak of. The only remotely useful thing you could possibly do with your miserable little existence is empty your bank account to help the family that actually has a legacy worth protecting. Terrence has major investors coming into town this week, and we simply cannot have my parents losing their house and embarrassing us in front of them. We need cash today, and we both know you have at least a few $1,000s hoarded away somewhere. I listened to them hurl their venomous insults, their voices dripping with that same familiar toxic entitlement I had heard my entire life. They were standing in my own home demanding I drain my life savings to patch the holes in a sinking ship that they themselves had personally torpedoed with their own hands over and over again. But I did not argue. I did not bother defending my apartment or explaining anything about my actual career. I did not tell them that my so-called Roach Motel had been a deliberate, strategic choice to stay off the radar of leeches exactly like them. Instead, I looked past Samantha, straight through the open doorway, out toward the large window at the end of the hallway that overlooked the busy street below. Parked right next to a bright red fire hydrant sitting squarely in a strictly enforced tow zone was Terrence's pristine white Range Rover, the exact same luxury SUV I had just legally flagged for immediate repossession less than 20 minutes earlier. The irony was so rich and so delicious that I could practically taste it sitting on my tongue. They had driven a soon-to-be repossessed vehicle to my apartment to demand I hand over my own hard-earned money to save their fake, crumbling little empire. Terrence had spent years acting like a billionaire while quietly defaulting on a car note he could never actually afford in the first place. I turned my attention back to Terrence, offering him a cold, empty smile. "I'm not giving you or my parents a single dime," I said, my voice completely steady and firm. "I'd suggest you tell them to sell some of those designer handbags and golf clubs to cover the mortgage instead." Terrence scoffed, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure disdain. He shook his head slowly in disgust. "You really are a pathetic failure," he spat, stepping back out into the hallway and intentionally scuffing his shoe against my rug on his way out. "Enjoy rotting in this roach motel for the rest of your life. Don't bother calling us when you finally realize you have nobody left in this world." Samantha gave me one last look of absolute contempt before turning sharply on her heel. "Let's go, Terrence. She's completely useless. We're wasting our precious time here with a lost cause." I watched them march down the hallway together, their angry, self-righteous footsteps echoing loudly against the cheap linoleum floor. I calmly closed my front door and locked the deadbolt behind them without any hurry at all. I walked straight over to the large window in my living room and looked down at the street below. Terrence and Samantha were climbing into the Range Rover, both of them completely oblivious to the financial guillotine already hovering directly over their heads, its blade quietly waiting to fall. They peeled away from the curb illegally, cutting hard into oncoming traffic and leaving nothing behind but a thick, oily cloud of exhaust hanging in the cold afternoon air. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened my secure encrypted contact list, scrolling past every one of my regular business associates without a second glance. I tapped a special priority number reserved for a premium asset recovery agency I used constantly for high-value corporate defaults. A gruff, clipped, entirely professional voice picked up on the second ring. "Hello, this is Rebecca, from Apex Holdings," I said, leaning my shoulder against the cold windowsill and watching the traffic crawl along the street below. "I have an immediate recovery order for a white Range Rover, license plate Alpha Tango 492. The commercial lease has been officially breached due to non-payment, and all corporate guarantor backing has been permanently revoked, effective immediately. The vehicle is currently mobile, heading back toward the downtown financial district. I need your absolute best repossession team on it right now. Track the onboard GPS and hook the vehicle the very second it parks. Do not give the driver a single inch to negotiate, argue, or stall. I want that car secured today." "Consider it done, ma'am," the voice replied sharply, without a trace of hesitation. I hung up the phone, and the cold, satisfied smile crept back onto my face. Terrence thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn a very public, very humiliating lesson about exactly who owned the ground beneath his expensive shoes. Less than an hour later, the scene unfolding at the Oakmont Valley Country Club looked like a postcard of serene upper-class perfection. The afternoon sun beat down warmly on the flawlessly manicured 18th hole, and on the elevated outdoor terrace overlooking the lush green fairways, Terrence was entirely, insufferably in his element. He held court at a premium corner table, surrounded by 3 wealthy local businessmen he was desperately trying to recruit as primary investors for his so-called phantom luxury condo project. He had changed out of his morning clothes and was now dressed in a pristine designer golf polo and tailored slacks that fit him like they'd been sewn on that morning. A bottle of absurdly expensive aged scotch sat at the center of the glass table, ordered confidently on a tab he had absolutely no way of paying. Terrence leaned back in his plush patio chair, swirling the amber liquid slowly in his crystal glass, doing what he did best, spinning an elaborate, glittering web of financial lies. He spoke loudly, theatrically, making sure the neighboring tables could hear every note of his performance. "Gentlemen, the downtown market is absolutely ripe for the taking," Terrence boasted, flashing that charismatic, practiced smile of his. "I've already secured the primary zoning permits, and my team is ready to break ground the moment the ink dries. I'm personally putting up the bulk of the equity myself, because I believe in having real skin in the game. Real estate isn't just about vision, it's about capital. Sure, but mostly it's about having the courage to execute when everyone else hesitates. My portfolio's doubled in the last 2 years alone, because I never backed down from a massive opportunity." The businessmen nodded along, sipping their drinks in polite agreement. They were older, established men, the type who'd been drawn in easily by his flashy exterior and his relentless confidence. Terrence had strategically slipped the head valet a $100 bill earlier that afternoon, just to keep his pristine white Range Rover parked directly in front of the main clubhouse entrance, right at the base of the terrace stairs. He wanted every single person walking into the country club to see the physical, gleaming manifestation of his supposed success. He pointed his glass down toward the driveway below. "You see that vehicle down there?" he said smoothly, almost lazily. "That's just the daily driver. When you reach my level of liquidity, you stop worrying about price tags and start worrying about return on investment." As the investors chuckled politely at his arrogance, the peaceful ambiance of the country club was violently, jarringly interrupted. A deafening mechanical roar echoed up the paved driveway, and the polite golf claps and hushed conversations on the terrace abruptly went silent. Every head turned. A massive industrial diesel tow truck, painted a glaring, high-visibility safety yellow, came barreling straight through the wrought iron gates. It completely ignored the valet parking signs and roared directly up to the main entrance, idling loudly and belching thick exhaust into the crisp air, clashing violently with the refined, understated atmosphere of the Oakmont Valley Country Club. Terrence frowned, gripping his glass a little tighter. "What on earth is security doing?" he muttered, trying and failing to maintain his composed facade. "They're letting absolute garbage trucks onto the property now? I should have a word with the club manager about this." But the tow truck did not simply pass through. It stopped abruptly, directly in front of Terrence's gleaming white Range Rover. A large, burly driver in a heavy canvas jacket climbed down from the cab, and he did not look remotely interested in country club etiquette. The head valet rushed forward, waving his arms frantically in protest, but the driver ignored him completely. With practiced, unhurried efficiency, the driver moved to the back of the truck and pulled a heavy metal lever. The hydraulic lift whined loudly, the sound echoing sharply across the terrace as the metal arms lowered and slid directly beneath the front tires of the luxury SUV. One of the older investors leaned forward, squinting through the sunlight. "Terrence," he said slowly, "is that not your vehicle they're hooking up?" Terrence froze. The blood drained completely from his face as his eyes locked onto the scene unfolding below. Panic replaced his manufactured confidence in an instant. He slammed his crystal glass down onto the table, spilling premium scotch across the glass surface in a dark amber pool. "Hey!" he screamed at the top of his lungs, abandoning every last trace of his sophisticated persona. "Hey, get away from my car! What the hell do you think you're doing?" He bolted from the table, practically sprinting down the sweeping stone staircase that led from the terrace to the main driveway below. The businessmen exchanged confused, uneasy glances before standing and walking to the edge of the balcony to watch the spectacle unfold. Dozens of other wealthy club members had already gathered at the railing, whispering among themselves as the drama escalated by the second. Terrence burst through the glass doors of the clubhouse and ran out onto the pavement. "Stop the lift right now," he roared, his face turning an angry, mottled shade of purple. "Do you have any idea who I am? I will sue you and your entire garbage company into the ground. That is a $100,000 vehicle. Unhook it right now, before I call the police, and have you arrested for grand theft auto." The tow truck driver did not flinch. He did not so much as blink. He calmly finished securing the heavy chains around the tires of the Range Rover and locked the hydraulic lift firmly into place. The front wheels of the SUV hovered a full foot off the ground. Only then did the driver turn to face Terrence, casually reaching into the front pocket of his canvas jacket to pull out a metal clipboard holding a thick stack of legal documents. "Are you Terrence?" the driver asked, his voice loud and remarkably steady, carrying easily up to the terrace where the stunned investors stood watching. "Yes, I'm Terrence," he shouted back, waving his arms wildly. "And you are making a massive mistake. My accounts are fully funded. This is illegal. Unhook my car immediately." The driver stepped forward and shoved the clipboard directly into Terrence's chest. "I don't care about your accounts, buddy," the driver said loudly, unbothered. "I have a direct order from the primary guarantor. This commercial lease has been officially breached due to non-payment and insufficient funds. Your backing has been permanently revoked." Terrence snatched the paperwork off the clipboard, his eyes darting frantically across the page, scanning past the dense legal jargon until they landed on the bold letterhead printed at the very top of the notice. Apex Holdings, LLC. The paper shook visibly in his hands. The color drained from his face a second time as the full weight of the situation crashed down on him. Apex Holdings hadn't simply stopped covering my parents' bills. They had systematically, deliberately, hunted him down. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," Terrence stammered, his voice suddenly losing every ounce of its booming authority. He looked around nervously, realizing with mounting horror that half the country club was staring directly at him. "Please, just let me make one phone call. Let me call Apex. I can clear this up in 5 minutes. I have the cash. You can call whoever you want, but you'll be walking while you do it. The driver replied coldly, already turning his back. He climbed into the cab of the yellow tow truck and slammed the door shut behind him. The diesel engine roared back to life. Terrence stood frozen on the immaculate driveway, utterly humiliated, clutching the notice of default in his trembling hands as the tow truck pulled forward and dragged his prized status symbol down the driveway and out through the front gates, leaving nothing behind but an empty parking space and a fading cloud of exhaust. Slowly, Terrence turned and looked back up at the terrace. His 3 wealthy investors were still standing at the railing. They were no longer smiling. They weren't impressed by his hustle, or his vision, or any of the empty words he'd been selling them all afternoon. They saw him now for exactly what he was, a desperate fraud who couldn't even afford the car he drove around in. Without a single word, the senior businessman picked his suit jacket up off the back of his chair, turned, and walked away from the table. The other 2 followed him without hesitation. By the time Terrence made it back up the stairs, his table sat completely empty, save for the spilled scotch and the shattered remains of his reputation. I was back at my kitchen island, calmly reviewing a risk assessment portfolio for one of my actual corporate clients, when my cell phone began buzzing aggressively against the granite countertop. The caller ID flashed my sister Samantha's name. I let it ring twice before swiping to answer, and I hadn't even brought the phone fully to my ear before her hysterical screaming filled my quiet apartment. "You vindictive, jealous little witch!" Samantha shrieked, her voice so loud and piercing I had to hold the phone away from my head. "Are you happy now? Are you proud of what you just did?" I kept my voice completely flat. "What exactly did I do, Samantha?" "Don't play dumb with me," she roared, her breathing ragged and frantic. "Terrence just called me from the country club. He was completely humiliated in front of his primary investors. You called the police and filed a fake stolen vehicle report, didn't you? You couldn't stand the fact that my husband was closing a massive real estate deal while you sit around in your pathetic roach motel doing meaningless data entry. You had his car illegally towed just to ruin his reputation. You're a disgusting, bitter person, Becca." I almost laughed out loud. The sheer scale of their delusion was genuinely astonishing. Terrence hadn't told her the truth about the lease default or the revoked corporate guarantee. He had spun a frantic, self-serving lie, blaming me for a fabricated police report to cover up his own total financial collapse. Before I could correct her, I heard the muffled sound of a brief struggle over the phone, followed by heavy footsteps. "Rebecca, listen to me very carefully," my father Thomas boomed into the receiver, his voice laced with a dark, threatening anger I had rarely heard from him. "You have crossed a line today that you cannot uncross. You have directly jeopardized this family's financial future with your petty jealousy. Terrence lost 3 major investors today because of your little stunt with the tow truck." "Dad, I didn't file a police report," I said calmly, stating the plain, simple truth. "I don't care what you did," he snapped, cutting me off entirely. "You're going to fix this. Tomorrow morning, you're going to go to your bank and take out a $50,000 personal loan. You will wire those funds directly to Terrence so he can secure a replacement vehicle and salvage his business deals. If you don't have the cash in his account by this Friday, you are completely cut off. You will be disowned. Don't call us. Don't show up at our house. You will no longer be my daughter. Do you understand me?" I stood in my kitchen, looking out the window at the flat, gray afternoon sky. My own father was threatening to erase me entirely from his life, all over a luxury car driven by a con artist. He was willing to throw me away without a second thought, just to protect an illusion of wealth I had secretly been funding for years. It was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. There was no going back from this, and honestly, by that point, I didn't want to. "I understand completely," I replied, keeping my tone submissive and quiet. "I'll bring the paperwork to the house on Friday." "See that you do," Thomas growled, and the line went dead. I tossed the phone onto the counter. I had promised to bring paperwork on Friday, and I fully intended to keep that promise. It just wasn't going to be the loan application they were expecting. But while I was mentally drafting my own legal documents, a much darker, far more malicious scheme was already unfolding inside their $1.2 million suburban home. I would later piece together the exact details of that afternoon through digital footprints, court records, and family confessions, and the sheer audacity of it still astounds me to this day. After hanging up on me, the panic inside my parents' house reached a fever pitch. Thomas's empty threats to disown me couldn't stop the financial bleeding. The mortgage portal was still flashing a past due balance. The country club was threatening to suspend their membership over unpaid dues, and Terrence was pacing desperately across the hardwood floors, watching his entire fake empire crumble around him in real time. He needed capital immediately, not just to buy a new car, but to maintain the massive, elaborate lie he had built his entire marriage on. He knew my $50,000 loan might not come through at all, or might not be enough to save them all. That was when my mother, Brenda, had a brilliant criminal idea. She remembered she still kept all my old high school and college financial aid documents locked away in a filing cabinet in the home office. Brenda convinced herself she was completely entitled to my identity. After all, she had given birth to me. In her twisted mind, my credit score was simply a family resource, sitting there quietly, waiting to be harvested. Because I had always lived a quiet, modest life, Brenda knew my credit was absolutely pristine. No debt, no late payments, a spotless financial record from top to bottom. To them, my clean credit profile looked like an untapped gold mine. Terrence and Brenda locked themselves in the home office. They rummaged through years of old tax returns and school files until they found exactly what they were looking for: my birth certificate and my pristine Social Security card. Driven by pure desperation and a breathtaking sense of entitlement, they booted up the family desktop computer. Terrence navigated straight to the online portal for the Small Business Administration. They didn't apply for some small personal loan just to scrape by. They decided, with total confidence, to go all in. Terrence typed my information into the federal forms with the steady, practiced hands of a seasoned con man. He knew exactly which boxes to check to slip past the automated flags. Using my full name, my date of birth, and my social security number, Terrence illegally submitted an expedited commercial loan application for $100,000. He falsified the employment records, claiming I was a silent equity partner in his real estate shell company. He checked every box confirming identity, authorized the hard credit pull, and forged my electronic signature without a single second of hesitation. Their plan was simple and entirely, coldly malicious. Once the $100,000 cleared into Terrence's account, he would use half of it to secure his luxury condo deposit and lease himself a new vehicle. He would hand the other half over to my parents to catch up on their mortgage and their country club dues. They figured that since I was just a lowly data entry clerk in their eyes, I would never monitor my credit closely enough to notice a commercial loan appearing out of nowhere. Or worse, they assumed that even if I somehow did find out, I would be far too weak and too intimidated by the family dynamic to ever report them to the authorities. They genuinely believed that family loyalty would force me to swallow the debt quietly and let them walk away scot-free. They hit submit on the application, completely confident in their flawless little crime, and celebrated together in the kitchen, convinced they had just outsmarted the entire banking system and secured their wealthy lifestyle for another year. They had absolutely no idea that my encrypted financial monitoring software was already, silently, capturing the breach in real time. The trap was set, and they had just gleefully, joyfully locked themselves inside it. I was still sitting at my kitchen island when my secure laptop let out a sharp, high-pitched chime, a sound I rarely heard. My custom-built financial monitoring software, the same system I use to track multi-million-dollar corporate accounts for Apex Holdings, had triggered a critical alert. I pulled the laptop closer and opened the encrypted dashboard. A bright red notification flashed across the screen, indicating a hard credit inquiry and a pending commercial loan application filed under my personal Social Security number. I clicked into the digital file, my eyes scanning the heavily formatted document. It was an application for a $100,000 Small Business Administration loan. The primary applicant was listed as me, but the receiving bank account belonged to a shell company registered directly to Terrence. The software didn't just flag the fraud, it actively traced the origin of the digital footprint. I ran a quick check on the IP address that had submitted the application, and within seconds the geographic ping landed on a painfully familiar residential address, my parents' $1.2 million suburban home. They had actually done it. My mother and my brother-in-law had conspired together to steal my identity. They had forged my signature and committed a federal crime, entirely convinced I was too weak, too ignorant, and too poor to ever notice. Most people in my position would have panicked. Most people would have immediately called the major credit bureaus, frozen their accounts, and killed the application dead in its tracks to protect their financial standing. But I was not most people. I was a senior financial risk analyst, and I knew exactly how federal banking law worked. If I stopped the loan application right now, it would simply be logged as attempted fraud. They could spin it, make desperate excuses, or claim it was all just a massive misunderstanding. Terrence would likely hire some sleazy lawyer to argue I had given verbal permission, and my parents would happily back up his lies. I didn't want a messy, drawn-out family dispute. I wanted them locked away. I wanted undeniable, concrete proof of a federal felony. Proof that no amount of smooth talking or parental guilt-tripping could ever erase. I picked up my phone and dialed a direct, unlisted number I kept reserved for high-level corporate emergencies. The call routed straight to a senior investigator in the Federal Bank Fraud Department, a man I had collaborated with on several large-scale corporate embezzlement cases through Apex Holdings. When he answered, I skipped the pleasantries and explained the situation quickly and clearly. I sent over the digital logs, the IP trace, and the fraudulent loan documents through a secure encrypted portal. I told him exactly who had submitted the application, exactly where they were located, and the precise routing number they were trying to funnel the money through. Then I made my unconventional request. I asked the federal investigator not to freeze the application. I asked him to let the automated system approve it, and to allow the full $100,000 wire transfer to process completely, all the way through. I wanted the money to successfully hit Terrence's business account. The investigator hesitated for a moment, reminding me of the considerable personal financial risk involved if the funds were actually dispersed. I assured him I had the capital to absorb any temporary fallout, and that Apex Holdings' legal team would handle the civil side of the breach on my end. I explained my logic plainly. Letting the wire transfer clear was the only way to definitively upgrade the crime from simple identity theft to aggravated federal wire fraud. Once that digital money crossed state lines and landed safely in his account, Terrence would no longer be dealing with local police. He would be looking at mandatory federal prison time. The investigator understood exactly what I was doing, and he agreed to set the trap, flagging the receiving account to freeze the instant the stolen funds arrived, ensuring Terrence could not spend a single dime of the money while the FBI quietly built their airtight case. The moment I finished coordinating with the federal agents, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed my Aunt Carol. I answered immediately. Her voice was hushed and frantic, like she was hiding somewhere. A closet. Maybe a bathroom. "Rebecca," she whispered urgently into the receiver. "I'm at your parents' house right now. You need to be extremely careful. I don't know what Terrence just did, but he came out of the home office with your mother a few minutes ago, and they're practically popping champagne. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice completely calm. What are they celebrating, Aunt Carol? They're acting like they just won the lottery, she replied, her breath hitching with genuine concern. Thomas is on the phone bragging to one of his country club friends about some massive sudden windfall. Terrence is pacing around the living room talking about how his luxury condo project is fully funded and how he's going to go buy a brand new car tomorrow. Brenda is already browsing luxury vacation packages online. Whatever they did, Rebecca, they look entirely too smug. I'm terrified they found a way to use your name for something illegal. You need to check your bank accounts right now. I listened to Aunt Carol's panicked breathing, genuinely touched by her loyalty. Out of everyone in that toxic family, she was the only one who actually cared about my well-being. I smiled, looking at the blinking green light on my laptop confirming that federal authorities were now actively monitoring Terrence's bank account. Don't worry, Aunt Carol, I said smoothly. Let them celebrate. Let them drink their expensive champagne and plan exactly how they're going to spend that money. Let Terrence brag about his real estate empire. Just do me one favor. Make sure you distance yourself from Terrence and my parents over the next few days. What do you mean? Aunt Carol asked, her voice trembling slightly. What's going on? The windfall they're celebrating isn't a winning lottery ticket, I replied, my voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp whisper. It's a one-way ticket to federal lockup. Don't say a word to them. Just watch the show. I thanked her for the warning and hung up the phone. My parents and my arrogant brother-in-law thought they had just secured their fake empire. They thought they'd outsmarted the system and successfully used me as their personal stepping stone. They had absolutely no idea that their triumphant little celebration was actually the countdown to their own complete destruction. All I had to do now was wait for the bank to process the wire transfer and hand the executioner his axe. The digital clock on my laptop flipped to exactly 8 in the morning. A secure email notification popped up on my screen, sent directly from the federal bank fraud investigator I'd spoken with the previous afternoon. The subject line was brief, almost clinical. Wire completed. Account frozen. I opened the message and read the short summary. The $100,000 Small Business Administration loan had officially crossed state lines, navigating through the complex Federal Reserve System, and had successfully deposited into Terrence's shell company bank account. The trap had officially snapped shut. By executing that interstate electronic transfer using a stolen identity, Terrence had crossed the point of no return. This was no longer a simple case of family financial abuse or a local police matter. It was aggravated federal wire fraud. The investigator confirmed that the receiving bank account had been immediately locked under federal mandate. Terrence could log into his phone and watch the massive six-figure balance glowing brightly on his screen. But the moment he tried to transfer a single cent, withdraw cash, or swipe his business debit card, the banking system would slam the door shut and aggressively deny the transaction. He was a starving man locked securely inside a glass bakery, and his fate was entirely sealed. He was currently sleeping off a heavy champagne hangover in his luxury master bedroom, completely oblivious to the federal crosshairs resting squarely on his chest. While Terrence lay deeply asleep, dreaming of his fake real estate empire and his stolen wealth, a very different reality was arriving at my parents' front door. It was a crisp, clear morning in their wealthy suburban neighborhood, the manicured lawns dusted in a light layer of frost. At exactly 9:15, a postal worker in a heavy blue jacket walked up their long, immaculate driveway. He wasn't carrying the usual stack of glossy fashion catalogs or country club newsletters. He was holding a thick, stiff cardboard envelope requiring a direct signature. My father, Thomas, still dressed in his expensive silk pajamas and a plush, monogrammed robe, opened the heavy oak door. He probably expected a delivery of expensive cigars, or maybe a gift basket from one of his country club friends congratulating him on the sudden family windfall they'd bragged about the night before. He smiled politely at the mail carrier, signed the electronic data pad with a flourish, and carried the heavy envelope inside, straight into the custom marble kitchen, where Brenda was casually sipping her morning espresso and browsing luxury tropical vacation sites on her tablet. Still riding the high of yesterday's stolen money, Thomas grabbed a silver letter opener from the counter and sliced through the thick cardboard seal, pulling out a dense stack of heavy legal paper. The bold black letters printed across the very top of the first page instantly drained the color from his face. Apex Holdings, LLC, Legal and Asset Recovery Division. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. Brenda looked up from her tablet, noticing my father's hands beginning to shake violently. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked, her voice suddenly tight with concern. Thomas read the first paragraph out loud, his voice cracking with sheer panic. It was a formal legal declaration stating that, due to consecutive missed payments and the immediate revocation of all corporate leniency agreements, the entire remaining balance of the mortgage was now accelerated and due in full. They weren't simply asking for the missed monthly payments to bring the account current. They were demanding the full $800,000 principal balance. If the funds weren't secured and wired to the corporate escrow account within exactly 30 days, Apex Holdings would legally seize the property, evict the current occupants, and sell the home at public auction. Brenda dropped her espresso cup. It shattered violently against the marble floor, splashing dark, scalding coffee across the pristine white cabinets and her expensive slippers. The illusion of their untouchable wealth evaporated in a single devastating second. The mysterious corporate benefactor they had mocked in their Thanksgiving video was no longer quietly paying their bills. It was now aggressively repossessing their entire life. Absolute chaos erupted in that kitchen. Brenda began screaming hysterically, demanding to know how this could possibly happen, insisting that Thomas fix it immediately before the neighbors caught wind of it and ruined their precious social standing. Thomas scrambled for his cell phone, his fingers slipping against the screen in his frantic rush. He dialed the corporate contact number listed at the bottom of the foreclosure notice, fully expecting to charm some mid-level customer service representative, maybe yell a little about loyalty, and demand an immediate extension. Instead, he was met with the cold, impenetrable fortress of my corporate phone system. "Thank you for calling Apex Holdings." A pleasant automated female voice chimed through the speakerphone. "If you are calling regarding a commercial acquisition, press 1. If you are calling regarding asset recovery, press 2. Thomas aggressively mashed the number 2 on his screen. The system routed him to another automated menu. "Please enter your 10-digit account reference number." He fumbled with the paperwork, reading the long string of numbers aloud in a desperate, shaking voice. The automated voice returned after a brief pause. "This account has been flagged for immediate foreclosure. All verbal negotiations are currently suspended. Please direct all inquiries in writing to our legal department. Goodbye." Thomas started shouting into the phone, demanding to speak to an actual human being. "Operator!" he yelled, pacing frantically back and forth across the coffee-stained floor. "Give me a representative right now. I have the money. We just got a massive loan. We can pay the balance." But the machine didn't care about his country club status or his silk robe. It simply, automatically, disconnected the call, leaving nothing but a flat, hollow tone echoing through the large kitchen. Thomas stood in the middle of his massive, expensive house, listening to the dead phone line, finally understanding that he was completely, utterly powerless. He could not charm his way out of this. He could not bully a machine. He could not manipulate a faceless corporate entity that felt no fear and offered no mercy. The walls of their perfect suburban fortress were closing in fast, and they were rapidly running out of air. It took exactly 4 hours for my mother to pivot from absolute panic to calculated manipulation. I was sitting at my desk watching the real-time digital updates on Terrence's frozen bank account when my cell phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed Brenda's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, deliberate breath to steady my pulse before answering. I expected screaming. I expected her to hurl vicious insults and demand to know why I hadn't magically fixed their financial ruin. But the sound that came through the speaker was something else entirely, the sound of heavy, theatrical sobbing. "Rebecca, my sweet girl," Brenda cried into the phone, her voice thick with manufactured grief, trembling with a perfectly practiced vulnerability. "Please don't hang up on me, please. Just listen. Your father and I have been doing a lot of soul-searching this morning, and we are just so incredibly heartbroken about how things have been between us." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, genuinely astonished by her acting ability. If I hadn't known that a massive foreclosure notice was sitting right on her kitchen counter, I might actually have believed she was experiencing a moment of genuine maternal clarity. I kept my voice soft and neutral. "What's wrong, Mother?" "Everything is wrong," she wailed, blowing her nose loudly into what was likely a monogrammed silk handkerchief. "We have been so hard on you, Rebecca. So blind. Your father and I were talking, and we realized we let the stress of Terrence's business deals and our own silly social obligations cloud our judgment. We pushed you away. We said terrible things to you on Thanksgiving. We want to fix this. We want to be a real family again." I stared at the blinking green indicator on my laptop confirming the federal fraud hold on Terrence's stolen $100,000. I knew exactly what this was. This was the desperate pivot. They had realized they couldn't bully a faceless corporate entity like Apex Holdings into saving their house, so they were falling back on their oldest, most reliable strategy: emotional manipulation. "I'm listening," I said quietly, offering her just enough rope to hang herself with. Brenda sniffled, her voice dropping into a gentle, pleading register. "As you know, our 35th wedding anniversary is this weekend. We've booked the grand ballroom at the Downtown Plaza Hotel. It's going to be a beautiful evening with all our friends and neighbors, but none of it will mean anything if our youngest daughter isn't there. We want you to come, Rebecca. We want to publicly apologize to you, in front of everyone. We want to show the world that we're united. Please say you'll come and let us make amends." The audacity of her request was almost suffocating. She was inviting me to a lavish, wildly expensive party, one I had unknowingly paid the deposit for through Apex Holdings, all to stage a fake public reconciliation while their entire world quietly burned down behind closed doors. They wanted me standing there, smiling for their country club friends, providing the perfect family optics to mask their absolute financial rot. "That sounds like a very big step, Mother," I replied carefully, keeping any trace of sarcasm out of my voice. "I'll have to check my schedule." "Please, Rebecca," she begged, her voice climbing in pitch. "Just come for an hour. Dress up. Let us take some nice family photos. It will mean the world to your father." I told her I would be there and ended the call. The moment the line disconnected, the fake emotional weight of her performance vanished from the air completely, replaced by a cold, hard truth. Brenda did not want to apologize. Thomas did not care about family photos. There was an ulterior motive driving this sudden, desperate olive branch, and I didn't have to wait long to find out exactly what it was. Less than 5 minutes after hanging up with my mother, my phone buzzed with a secure text message from Aunt Carol. A massive block of text, typed frantically and packed with urgent warnings. "Do not believe a single word Brenda just said to you," Aunt Carol wrote. "I'm still at the house. Terrence just got off the phone with his bank. The $100,000 business loan he took out is completely frozen. The bank flagged the wire transfer for suspected identity fraud. They told Terrence the only way they'll release the hold and let him access the money is if the primary applicant physically signs a retroactive authorization affidavit in front of a licensed notary, proving the application was legitimate. Terrence is absolutely losing his mind. He told your father he hired a shady mobile notary to attend the anniversary party disguised as a guest. Their plan is to corner you in the VIP suite before dinner starts. They're going to use the party to guilt trip you. They think that if you're surrounded by 100 guests and all that family pressure, you'll be too embarrassed to cause a scene, and you'll just sign the paper to keep the peace. They need that money to stop the foreclosure on the house. Do not go to that party, Rebecca. It's a trap. I read Aunt Carol's message twice, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. It wasn't just a trap. It was an act of supreme, arrogant desperation. Terrence had committed a federal felony, realized he was caught inside an automated banking freeze, and his brilliant solution was to ambush his victim at a luxury cocktail party and force her to legally absolve him of the crime. He actually believed my fear of social awkwardness would override my basic instinct for survival. He thought the heavy, toxic weight of family expectation would break me. I typed a quick reply to Aunt Carol. Thank you for the warning. Don't worry, I'm going to the party. I set my phone down and looked at my calendar. The anniversary party was exactly 48 hours away. My parents wanted a grand public spectacle. They wanted all their wealthy neighbors, their country club friends, and their fake high society associates gathered in one room to witness the perfection of their family. They wanted me to step onto their carefully constructed stage, bow my head, and quietly sign away my identity to save their crumbling facade. I decided right then that I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would attend their lavish 35th anniversary party. I would stand in front of their 100 guests. But I was not going to sign a retroactive authorization form to save Terrence from a federal prison sentence. I was going to use their own beautiful, expensive stage to burn their fake empire straight to the ground. I had 48 hours to shed the skin of the pathetic failure they so desperately needed me to be. For 5 long years, I had meticulously curated a wardrobe of faded sweaters, generic denim, and scuffed boots pulled from discount clothing racks. It was a physical camouflage, carefully designed to protect my peace and keep their endless greed at bay. But camouflage was no longer necessary. I was going to war, and I needed armor. First thing Friday morning, I drove my beat-up Honda Civic to the wealthiest, most exclusive shopping district in Buckhead, deliberately choosing a location far removed from my mother's usual suburban boutiques. I walked into a private, appointment-only designer atelier. The perfectly groomed saleswoman initially gave my thrift store winter coat a skeptical, faintly condescending look, her smile tight and unimpressed. Her entire demeanor transformed the moment I bypassed the clearance rack and placed my solid metal black card flat on the immaculate glass counter. I told her I needed an evening gown that commanded absolute authority. We spent 3 solid hours in the private fitting room, discarding anything that looked overly flashy or the least bit desperate. I finally settled on a breathtaking floor-length gown made of heavy midnight blue silk, structural, elegant, and unapologetically expensive. The resident tailor worked straight through his lunch break to make sure it fit my body with flawless, razor-sharp precision. I paired the gown with a pair of authentic diamond drop earrings I had purchased years earlier to celebrate my first $1 million corporate acquisition, but had never once actually worn in public. The physical transformation didn't stop with the wardrobe. I hired a premium mobile styling team to come to my modest apartment Saturday afternoon. It was a genuinely hilarious contrast, watching 2 high-end beauty professionals hauling heavy ring lights and massive metal cases of luxury cosmetics up the poorly lit stairs of my supposed Roach Motel. They spent over 2 hours washing, blow-drying, and styling my hair into sleek, polished waves that cascaded perfectly over my bare shoulders. They applied immaculate, high-definition makeup that sharpened my cheekbones and gave my eyes a cold, piercing intensity. When they finally finished and packed up their expensive gear, I stood in front of the cheap, cracked mirror hanging on my bedroom closet door. The woman staring back at me was completely unrecognizable to the family that had mocked her for years. There was no trace left of the quiet, submissive girl who kept her head down at the Thanksgiving dinner table. I looked exactly like what I was, the highly successful, unyielding chief executive officer of a massive financial holding firm. With my appearance perfected, I moved on to the most critical phase of my preparation, the ammunition. I sat down at my kitchen island and opened my encrypted work laptop. I didn't want to leave any room for debate, confusion, or gaslighting when I finally took the stage that night. I needed a presentation that was blunt, highly visual, and absolutely devastating. I opened a fresh digital slideshow. For the first slide, I imported the video Aunt Carol had forwarded to me, running the file through a professional audio enhancement program, stripping away the background jazz music and heavily amplifying my parents' and Terrence's voices. I wanted their cruel laughter and their vicious insults about my absolute uselessness to echo through the massive hotel ballroom with crystal-clear acoustic precision. For the second slide, I pulled the official corporate registration documents directly from the Georgia Secretary of State database. I used a bright yellow digital marker to highlight the bold text that read, Apex Holdings, LLC, and directly beneath it, sole member and chief executive officer, Rebecca. It was undeniable, legally binding proof that they had been living entirely on my silent charity for years. For the third and final slide, I compiled the ultimate kill shot. I took high-resolution screenshots of the fraudulent Small Business Administration loan application, placing Terrence's forged digital signature right beside the bank's internal IP address tracking log. I drew a thick, bright red digital circle around the geographic ping that traced the illegal submission directly to the router inside my parents' home office. I added a small, crisp text box at the very bottom, detailing the exact federal penal codes and mandatory minimum prison sentences for aggravated wire fraud and identity theft. I reviewed the 3 slides carefully. It was a masterpiece of absolute methodical destruction. I exported the master file, reached into my desk drawer, and pulled out a brand new, sleek red USB drive. The vibrant color reminded me of a hazardous warning light. I plugged it into the laptop and dragged the presentation onto the drive, then safely ejected the device and held it in the palm of my hand. It weighed practically nothing, yet it contained enough explosive truth to completely obliterate 4 lives in a matter of minutes. I slipped the sleek red USB drive into a brand new, structured designer clutch that perfectly matched my midnight blue gown. I looked around my quiet, modest apartment one last time. This small space had been my sanctuary for years, a quiet refuge from their endless demands and toxic expectations. But tonight, I was finally, permanently closing the door on my double life. I didn't bother grabbing the keys to my rusty Honda Civic. Instead, I opened a luxury ride-sharing app on my phone and ordered a premium black car service. 10 minutes later, a pristine, jet-black executive SUV pulled up to the curb outside my building. The driver stepped out in a sharp black suit for me. I slid into the plush leather interior, the smell of expensive car wax and new leather filling the quiet cabin. As the driver navigated away from my neighborhood and merged onto the highway heading toward the Downtown Plaza Hotel, I leaned back against the headrest and watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows. My heart was not racing. My palms were not sweating. I felt no lingering anxiety, no daughterly guilt. I had given them every opportunity in the world to be decent human beings. They had chosen, again and again, to be parasites. The trap was set, the stage was rented, and the executioner was already on her way. The black executive SUV glided smoothly to a halt in front of the sweeping glass entrance of the Downtown Plaza Hotel. A uniformed valet rushed forward to open my door, his eyes widening slightly as I stepped onto the red carpet in my heavy midnight blue silk gown. The crisp evening air brushed against my bare shoulders, but I felt absolutely no chill. I walked through the revolving doors and entered the grand lobby, following the elegant gold-plated signs directing guests toward the Diamond Ballroom for the 35th anniversary celebration. The closer I got to the ballroom doors, the louder the low hum of privileged conversation became. I paused just outside the entrance, taking a moment to survey the room before stepping fully into the viper's nest. It was a masterclass in superficiality. Over 100 guests were scattered across the massive room, sipping premium cocktails beneath dripping crystal chandeliers. I recognized most of them: the wealthy neighbors from my parents' subdivision, the aggressive board members of the local homeowners association, and the snobby regulars from the Oakmont Valley Country Club. Women draped in diamonds they likely couldn't afford air-kissed each other's cheeks, while men in rented tuxedos boasted about their golf handicaps and fabricated investment portfolios. My parents had pulled out every possible stop for this glittering display of prosperity. Massive floral arrangements of white roses covered every single table. A string quartet played softly in the far corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to their massive lie. It was an incredibly expensive illusion, funded entirely by a house of cards currently collapsing under the weight of federal fraud and imminent foreclosure. I adjusted my grip on my matching designer clutch, feeling the hard edges of the red USB drive tucked inside, and stepped fully into the ballroom. For the first few moments, no one even realized who I was. Heads turned. Eyes lingered on the expensive cut of my gown and the authentic diamonds sparkling at my ears. But there was no immediate recognition. They were used to seeing Rebecca, the failure, the quiet girl who stood in the background wearing scuffed boots and oversized sweaters, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. The woman walking through the crowd now radiated a terrifying level of confidence. I glided past a cluster of my mother's friends, catching their curious whispers as I completely ignored their presence. I belonged in this environment far more than any of them did, because my wealth was actually real. I didn't even make it halfway across the room before my path was aggressively blocked. Terrence stepped directly in front of me, his tall frame clad in a tailored black tuxedo. At first glance, he looked like the perfect picture of success, but looking closer, I could see absolute panic swimming in his dark eyes. A thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead, catching the light from the chandeliers, and his jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched visibly in his cheek. He reached up to adjust his bow tie, intentionally flashing a massive, brand-new, solid gold Rolex on his wrist. It was a sickening detail. He had used the very first fraction of the stolen $100,000 loan to buy himself another piece of jewelry before the federal bank freeze locked him out of the account entirely. It was the ultimate symbol of his reckless, bottomless greed. He offered no greeting. He didn't compliment my appearance or ask how I was doing. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and yanked out a folded clipboard, shoving it violently against my chest. "You're late," he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper so the nearby guests wouldn't overhear. I took a half step back, refusing to touch the clipboard. "What is this, Terrence?" I asked, keeping my voice light and perfectly conversational. "Don't play games with me tonight, Becca," he snarled, his eyes darting nervously around the room to make sure no one was watching us too closely. "It's the retroactive bank authorization form. I brought a licensed notary. He's sitting at the bar right now. You're going to walk over there with me. You're going to show him your ID, and you're going to sign this paper confirming you authorized the business loan. We need to clear that freeze tonight." I looked down at the paper clipped to the board, then back up into his panicked, arrogant face. "And what if I don't want to sign it?" I asked calmly. Terrence leaned in close, his breath thick with premium scotch and pure desperation. Sign this right now, or I'm calling the cops immediately, he threatened, his voice dripping with malice. I'll tell them you committed commercial loan fraud. I'll tell them you used my company computer to apply for the money because you're a broke, jealous failure trying to ruin my business. Who do you think they're going to believe? The successful real estate developer standing in a tuxedo, or the pathetic data entry clerk who lives in a roach motel? You'll go to prison, Becca. Sign the paper and save yourself. It was a fascinating psychological display. He was trying to frame me for the exact federal crime he had committed against me. He genuinely believed he could bully me into legally covering his tracks by weaponizing my own identity. I looked at the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist, then at the clipboard trembling in his hand. Slowly, a cold, empty smile spread across my face. I reached out and took the clipboard from him. For one brief second, a wave of profound relief washed over his face. He actually thought he had won. He thought I was submitting to his demands out of sheer terror. Instead of walking toward the bar, I simply handed the clipboard right back to him, pressing it flat against his chest, the exact same way he had shoved it at me. I think you're going to need a much better lawyer, Terrence, I whispered sweetly. I stepped around him and left him standing frozen in the middle of the crowded ballroom, clutching his useless legal document. I didn't look back. I kept my posture perfectly straight as I navigated through the sea of wealthy guests, making a direct line for the raised stage at the front of the room. Tucked just beside the stage was the audiovisual control booth, where a young technician was managing the lighting and background music from a massive digital soundboard. The trap was fully loaded. It was time to pull the trigger. I reached the small, dimly lit audiovisual booth tucked neatly beside the main stage. The young technician was wearing oversized headphones, sliding dials on his soundboard. I tapped him gently on the shoulder. He pulled one headphone off, looking at me with mild confusion. I held out the sleek red USB drive, placing it directly on his control panel. I need you to plug this into the main projection system, I told him quietly, sliding a crisp $100 bill next to the drive. There's a single video file and a short slideshow on there. When I pick up the secondary microphone on the stage and say the word present, I want you to dim the chandelier lights and play the video at maximum volume. Do you understand? The technician looked at the $100 bill, then up at my expensive designer gown and diamond earrings. He gave me a sharp nod, swept the cash into his pocket, and plugged the red drive into his laptop. Consider it done, he whispered. I stepped back into the shadows near the edge of the stage and waited. A few moments later, the string quartet gracefully finished their classical piece. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, signaling the beginning of the formal program. The low hum of wealthy chatter quieted as my father, Thomas, walked confidently up the short flight of stairs to the raised stage. He stepped behind the clear acrylic podium, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. My mother, Brenda, followed closely behind him, wearing a glittering silver dress that clung perfectly to her frame. She linked her arm through his, playing the role of the devoted, adoring matriarch to absolute perfection. Good evening, everyone, Thomas boomed into the microphone, his deep, charismatic voice echoing flawlessly across the massive ballroom. Thank you all for joining Brenda and me tonight to celebrate 35 years of marriage. Looking out at this incredible crowd, I'm reminded of how truly blessed we are. We're surrounded by our dearest friends, our esteemed colleagues, and most importantly, our family. The crowd offered a polite, warm round of applause. Thomas smiled humbly, soaking in the admiration, waiting for the clapping to fade before continuing his performance. 35 years is a long time, he said, his tone turning serious and reflective. We've weathered our fair share of storms. We've faced economic downturns, personal setbacks, and the heavy burdens of building a lasting legacy. But we survived, because we always put family first. We survived because we understand the value of hard work and mutual support. I stood in the shadows, listening to the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy pouring out of his mouth. He was standing on a stage rented with my money, wearing a tuxedo paid for by my corporate accounts, lecturing a room full of millionaires about hard work. Of course, Thomas continued, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed directly on Terrence and Samantha near the front table. A legacy is only as strong as the next generation. Brenda and I are so incredibly proud of our eldest daughter and our son-in-law. Terrence is currently closing one of the largest commercial real estate deals in the city. He understands what it takes to succeed. He understands that in this world, you either contribute to the empire or you become a burden to it. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room again. I could feel his eyes searching for me in the crowd, ready to deliver his public shaming. Sadly, not everyone grasps that concept, he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. Some people choose the path of least resistance. Some people are content to sit back, offer nothing, and feed off the success of those around them. But as a family, we must carry them anyway. That is the true burden of success. We love them even when they are a complete disappointment. A quiet, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the guests. They all knew exactly who he was talking about. Samantha smirked from her seat, raising her champagne glass toward her father. Terrence, however, was not smiling. He stared at the floor, sweating profusely, knowing exactly what was waiting for him at the bank. My father had delivered his ultimate insult. He had used his grand anniversary speech to publicly brand me a useless parasite in front of 100 wealthy socialites. It was the perfect cue. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly up the stage stairs, my midnight blue gown rustling softly against the carpeted steps. The guests in the front row noticed me first, their conversations dying instantly as they took in my appearance. I did not look like the pathetic failure Thomas had just described. I walked straight past my mother, who gasped audibly, her eyes widening in shock as she took in my designer dress and diamond earrings. I reached the secondary microphone stand positioned on the far left side of the stage, gripped the heavy metal stand, pulled the microphone from its cradle, and flicked the power switch on. A sharp, high-pitched whine of audio feedback pierced the room, causing several guests to cover their ears. Thomas stopped speaking instantly, his charismatic smile freezing on his face. He turned toward me, his eyes flashing with confusion and intense anger. "Rebecca, what are you doing?" Brenda hissed at me through her perfectly applied lipstick. "Get down from there right now. You're ruining the speech." I ignored her completely and turned my attention to the sea of faces staring up at me from the ballroom floor. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the massive speakers. "I'm sorry to interrupt such a moving and beautifully written tribute to family values. My father is absolutely right. A family legacy is built on sacrifice, hard work, and financial transparency." Thomas gripped the edges of his clear acrylic podium, his knuckles turning completely white. "Rebecca, put the microphone down," he commanded in a low, threatening tone. "We will discuss whatever this is at home." "But we're all here right now, Dad," I replied smoothly, offering him a cold, empty smile. "And since you just spent the last 5 minutes talking about the importance of contributing to the family empire, I thought this would be the perfect moment to share my contribution. I know I've always been the quiet one, the daughter who supposedly brings nothing to the table. So, to celebrate your 35th anniversary, I brought a special present for the whole family to see." I turned my head slightly toward the audiovisual booth and made direct eye contact with the young technician. He had his hand resting firmly on the control board, waiting for the signal. The entire ballroom was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. "Let's take a look at the real family legacy," I said clearly into the microphone. "Play the present." The technician hit the button. The massive crystal chandeliers above us immediately dimmed to black. The giant LED projection screens flanking the stage flickered to life. The trap was sprung. The twin screens illuminated the darkness with a blinding high-definition glare. For a split second, there was nothing but the crisp white logo of the Plaza Hotel. But that was instantly replaced by the intimate, unpolished footage of my parents' custom marble kitchen. The image was massive. My father's face was projected 10 feet high, and the sheer scale of the video made his cruel, sneering expression look downright demonic. The technician had followed my instructions perfectly. The audio enhancement software I'd used was flawless. The background jazz of the original video was completely muted, pushing my parents' voices to the absolute forefront. When Thomas spoke on the video, his voice echoed off the ballroom walls with a booming, inescapable clarity. "Rebecca is a pathetic failure," the digital version of my father sneered, raising his crystal flute of premium champagne. "At 33, she's still doing freelance data entry. At least she makes Terrence look like a genius." Laughter erupted from the screens. The harsh, mocking laughter of Terrence and Samantha, synchronized perfectly with the visual of Terrence adjusting his flashy designer suit. Then the video panned slightly, bringing my mother, Brenda, into sharp focus. She took a delicate sip of her champagne, rolled her eyes, and delivered the line that had set this entire chain of events into motion. "Thank God for Apex Holdings paying off our debts, because that girl is absolutely useless." The contrast between Thomas standing on the stage preaching about family values and Thomas on the screen mocking his own daughter was jarring beyond words. The reaction in the room was instantaneous and viscerally physical. A collective, sharp gasp rippled through the crowd of 100 wealthy guests. The polite upper-class murmurs vanished entirely, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. You could physically see the shock registering on the faces of the country club elite and the neighborhood association board members. Women in expensive gowns covered their mouths in horror. Men who had just been clapping for my father's heartwarming speech now stared at the screens in utter disbelief. They were witnessing the ugly, rotten core of the family that had spent years parading around as the very epitome of suburban perfection. On the stage, the reality of the situation crashed into Thomas like a freight train. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked frantically between the giant LED screens and the horrified faces of his friends in the audience. He gripped the edges of his podium so hard his knuckles turned white, then leaned into his microphone and let out a forced, high-pitched chuckle that sounded like a dying animal. "Well?" Thomas stammered, his charismatic voice now cracking with raw panic. "I suppose we all have those moments, don't we? A little family joke taken completely out of context. You know how these private jokes can sound to outsiders. Rebecca always had a very unique sense of humor. This is just a silly little video from Thanksgiving. Please, someone turn that off. Let's get back to the celebration." He waved his hand aggressively toward the audiovisual booth, gesturing for the technician to cut the feed. But the young man at the soundboard simply crossed his arms and looked the other way. The $100 bill was safely in his pocket, and he was clearly enjoying the drama unfolding in front of him. The video did not stop. In fact, it had reached the end of its timeline, but I had intentionally coded the file to loop the most devastating 10 seconds on repeat. The massive screens flashed briefly, and the digital version of my father appeared once again. "Rebecca is a pathetic failure," the booming voice repeated, echoing across the silent ballroom. "At least she makes Terrence look like a genius. Thank God for Apex Holdings paying off our debts, because that girl is absolutely useless." The loop played a second time, then a third. With every repetition, the words struck the audience like physical blows. There was no way for Thomas to spin this as a joke. There was no context that could possibly excuse the pure malice radiating from their faces on the screen. The truth was laid entirely bare. Not only had they been horribly abusive to their youngest daughter, but they had also just publicly confessed to being completely broke. My mother had clearly stated on camera that an anonymous company called Apex Holdings was paying off their debts. The illusion of their massive self-made wealth was shattered completely in front of the exact people they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. I looked over at Brenda. She had taken several steps back from the podium, her hands pressed tightly over her face, as if she could physically block out the shame. Her glittering silver anniversary dress suddenly looked cheap and ridiculous. Down on the ballroom floor, Terence had visibly shrunk into himself. His arrogant posture was gone. He stared at the ground, realizing his own fake real estate empire was now directly tied to the public humiliation of his in-laws. Samantha sat frozen in her chair, her face burning a bright, furious red, unable to meet the eyes of any of her wealthy friends. Thomas slammed his fist against the podium, abandoning his fake laughter entirely. "Turn it off," he roared, his voice trembling with sheer rage. "Turn that screen off right now, or I will have you fired." I calmly raised my microphone. The speaker screeched slightly before my voice cut through his desperate shouting. "Why do you want to turn it off, Dad?" I asked, my tone dripping with dangerous sweetness. "I thought we were celebrating the family legacy. I thought we were celebrating transparency and hard work. You just told 100 of your closest friends that we have to carry the burden of those who contribute nothing. I just wanted to show them exactly who's carrying whom." The video looped for a fourth time in the background. Thank God for Apex Holdings paying off our debts. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the stage, bringing myself directly under the spotlight, and let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, giving the guests time to fully process the humiliating spectacle unfolding in front of them. Thomas was hyperventilating, his chest heaving beneath his rented tuxedo. He glared at me with a hatred so pure it could have burned a hole through steel. But I was no longer afraid of him. He had absolutely zero power over me. "You called me useless," I said into the microphone, my voice steady and commanding. "You stood in a house that I kept from going into foreclosure, drinking champagne that I indirectly paid for. And you laughed at my expense. You told the world I was a failure because I don't wear designer clothes or drive luxury cars. But the funny thing about being a failure is that you learn how to keep incredibly detailed receipts." The crowd leaned in collectively, hanging on every word. The shock of the video had only been the appetizer. They could sense the main course was about to be served, and no one dared to look away. I turned my head toward the audiovisual booth one more time and gave the technician a sharp, decisive nod. It was time to show them exactly who Apex Holdings was. I gave the technician the signal. He tapped a key on his laptop, and the humiliating loop of my parents laughing instantly vanished. The massive LED screens flickered and then filled with the bright, sterile white background of an official government website, the Georgia Secretary of State Business Registry. The text was magnified to an enormous size, making it impossible for anyone in the room to miss the details. I had used a bright yellow digital highlighter over the most important section of the legal document. At the top, the entity name was displayed in bold black lettering, Apex Holdings, LLC. Right beneath it, Registered Agent, Sole Member, and Chief Executive Officer, Rebecca. It took about 5 seconds for the reality of those words to fully penetrate the minds of the wealthy guests. When it did, the reaction was a low, sweeping murmur that quickly escalated into a chaotic buzz of disbelief. People pointed at the screens, whispering frantically to their spouses, staring at me with a completely new level of reverence and shock. The neighborhood association board members, who had always looked down their noses at my thrift store clothes, were suddenly realizing that I was the phantom billionaire who had effectively been funding their entire social circle. I turned to look at my father. Thomas was gripping the clear acrylic podium so tightly I thought it might snap. His mouth was opening and closing, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land, Brenda was clutching her chest, her diamond necklace rising and falling with her erratic, panicked breaths. Down on the floor, Terrence had gone completely rigid. I could see the exact moment his brain connected the dots. The mysterious corporate entity that had guaranteed his luxury car lease, the same entity that had brutally repossessed it at the country club in front of his investors, was standing right in front of him, holding a microphone. I brought the microphone back to my lips. My voice cut through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd, silencing the room instantly. 5 years ago, I began, my voice calm, measured, and completely devoid of mercy. 5 years ago, Thomas and Brenda were facing absolute financial ruin. They had recklessly spent their way into a corner, and the bank was preparing to foreclose on their perfect suburban dream. They were terrified of losing their status. They were terrified of losing their precious country club memberships and the admiration of everyone standing in this room tonight. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the crowd of socialites. I knew that if I simply handed them the money, they would bleed me dry and keep treating me like a second-class citizen. So I created Apex Holdings. I bought their debt. I became the anonymous corporate benefactor they thanked in their little video. Thomas shook his head frantically, stepping away from the podium. "No," he whispered hoarsely, his voice carrying just enough to be picked up by his own microphone. "No, that's impossible. You do data entry. You drive a rusted car." "I drive a rusted car because I don't need a luxury vehicle to validate my existence," I shot back smoothly. "But since we're on the topic of luxury vehicles, let's talk about the family finances. Let's break down exactly what the pathetic failure has been paying for over the last half-decade." I turned toward the audience, treating the ballroom like a corporate boardroom. Over the past 5 years, Apex Holdings has quietly dispersed over $1.5 million to maintain the illusion of this family's wealth. Every single month, I paid the $4,000 mortgage on the house you're currently living in. I paid the exorbitant property taxes. I paid the $800 utility bundles so you could keep the heated swimming pool running all winter. I even paid the monthly dues at the Oakmont Valley Country Club, letting you drink premium scotch and pretend you were titans of industry. I shifted my gaze directly to Terrence. He physically flinched under the spotlight. I looked at the brand new gold Rolex on his wrist. "And let's not forget the golden child and her incredibly successful husband," I continued, my voice dripping with contempt. When Terrence needed to lease a $100,000 Range Rover to convince his investors he was a real estate mogul, his personal credit was completely worthless. Apex Holdings signed as the silent corporate guarantor. "I paid for the car you drove, Terrence, and when you pushed me too far, I was the one who ordered the tow truck to rip it away from you at the valet stand." Samantha let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. The wealthy neighbors sitting at their table actively leaned away from them, as if they were carrying a contagious disease. "But the absolute height of your hypocrisy," I said, bringing my focus back to my parents on the stage, "is this very evening. You invited all these wonderful people here to celebrate 35 years of marriage. You wanted to show off. You wanted to prove you're the elite of Atlanta. You stood up here and bragged about your empire. But let me make this abundantly clear to everyone in this room." I raised my free hand, gesturing to the massive floral centerpieces, the crystal chandeliers, and the elegant catering stations. "I paid for this party. The deposit for the Plaza Hotel Diamond Ballroom was wired from an Apex Holdings corporate account. The champagne you're drinking right now was bought with my money. The string quartet playing in the corner was hired by my executive assistant. Every single bite of food, every single flower, every single perfectly folded linen napkin in this room was provided by the daughter you just called an absolutely useless parasite." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and heavy. Nobody took a sip of their drinks. Nobody touched their food. The guests were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the deception they had just uncovered. They were attending a luxury gala funded entirely by the very victim of the people hosting it. My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail. She finally collapsed to her knees on the stage, her glittering silver dress pooling around her. She reached her hands out toward me, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "Rebecca, please," she sobbed loudly, abandoning all sense of dignity. "We didn't know. We didn't understand. You have to forgive us. We're your family." I looked down at her groveling on the carpet. It was a pathetic display, but it wasn't enough. They hadn't just insulted me. They hadn't just used me. They had tried to frame me for a federal felony. The financial humiliation was complete, but the legal execution was just about to begin. I turned my attention back to the audiovisual booth and gave the technician the final signal. It was time to show the crowd exactly how desperate my family had become. Before the technician could execute the next command, a sharp, hysterical scream tore through the heavy silence of the ballroom. It was Samantha. She had leapt up from her chair, knocking her crystal champagne flute onto the carpet, where it shattered into dozens of glittering pieces. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me from across the room, her face flushed dark red with fury. "You're a liar!" Samantha shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. "You're a disgusting, manipulative liar. You don't own a massive company. You do data entry. If you actually have that kind of money, you stole it. You must have embezzled it from some corporate account and set up a fake LLC to hide your tracks. That's what this is. You're a criminal, Rebecca, and you're just trying to drag our family name through the mud to cover up your own illegal activities." The guests murmured frantically, their heads swiveling back and forth between me on the stage and my sister on the floor, like they were watching an intense tennis match. Samantha took a few steps forward, desperately trying to rally the wealthy crowd to her side. "Think about it," she yelled to the audience, gesturing wildly. "Does she look like a CEO to you? She's just trying to ruin my husband's reputation because she's deeply jealous. She's always been incredibly jealous of Terrence and his massive success." I stood completely still under the bright spotlight, letting her scream herself hoarse. Her absolute dedication to her own delusional reality was almost impressive. She was watching her entire world burn to the ground, and her immediate instinct was to accuse me of the exact behavior her husband was actually guilty of. "Jealous of Terrence," I repeated slowly, my voice projecting smoothly and powerfully through the microphone. "That's an incredibly interesting choice of words, Samantha, because I don't think anyone in this beautiful room would ever be jealous of a man facing decades in a federal penitentiary." I turned my head toward the audiovisual booth and gave the young technician a sharp nod. "Next slide, please." The giant LED screens behind me shifted instantly. The Georgia Secretary of State Business Registry disappeared, replaced by a massive, highly detailed screenshot of a formal legal banking document, the Small Business Administration commercial loan application. I had circled 3 specific areas of the dense document in bright red digital marker so the audience could easily follow along. "Since my sister wants to loudly discuss criminals and embezzlement," I announced, pacing slowly across the front of the stage, "let's look at some actual, federally documented crimes." 2 days ago, my father gave me a strict ultimatum. He told me that if I didn't take out a $50,000 personal loan to replace Terrence's repossessed car, I would be entirely disowned by this family. When I didn't immediately hand over the cash to fund their lies, my parents and my brother-in-law decided to take matters into their own hands. I raised my free hand and pointed directly at the massive screen behind me. "This is an expedited commercial loan application for $100,000. If you look at the first red circle, you'll see the primary applicant is listed as me. It includes my full legal name, my date of birth, and my pristine Social Security number. But if you look at the second red circle, you'll see that the receiving bank account for this 6-figure federal loan belongs to a shell company registered entirely to Terrence." The ballroom erupted into loud gasps of sheer horror. The wealthy neighbors who had just been listening to Samantha's frantic accusations now looked at her and Terrence with open disgust. Identity theft was a dirty, low-class crime, and doing it to your own flesh and blood was completely unforgivable in their elite social circles. They broke into my old childhood files, I continued, making sure my voice carried clearly over the rising chaos in the room. My mother happily provided my birth certificate. Terrence forged my electronic signature. They actively stole my identity and submitted this fraudulent application to the federal government because they were absolutely desperate for cash to stop the foreclosure on this very house. Thomas stumbled backward on the stage, his face turning an even paler, sickening shade of gray. He reached out with a trembling hand, trying to grab the microphone from me, but I simply pulled the heavy metal stand out of his reach. "But the absolute best part of this document," I said, my voice rising in intensity and commanding total authority, "is the digital footprint. Because Terrence is nowhere near as smart as he pretends to be. When you submit a federal financial document online, the system permanently logs the exact geographic origin of the submission." I pointed to the final red circle at the bottom of the glowing screen. "Right there is the IP address tracking log. Let me read it out loud for everyone in the room." I ran a standard trace on that exact address. It doesn't lead to a corporate real estate office downtown. It pings directly to the wireless internet router located inside the home office of Thomas and Brenda. You committed aggravated federal wire fraud from your own house, Dad, and you left a digital trail a mile wide. The absolute finality of the physical evidence struck the room like a bomb. The document on the screen was completely irrefutable. There was no way to spin it. No way to blame a clerical error or claim a simple misunderstanding. Terrence had stolen $100,000, and my parents had actively, willingly helped him do it. Down on the ballroom floor, something inside Terrence finally snapped. The sheer, overwhelming terror of his impending arrest, combined with the total public destruction of his fake persona, pushed him right over the edge into pure animalistic panic. He let out a primal, furious roar that violently pierced the air. "Shut up!" Terrence screamed, his face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage. "Turn that screen off right now!" He shoved a heavy banquet chair completely out of his way, knocking over a tall tray of expensive champagne glasses that shattered loudly against the floor, and charged directly toward the stage like a cornered animal. He was no longer trying to argue his innocence. He was trying to physically silence me. He reached the bottom of the stage stairs in seconds, his hands curling into tight, violent fists, his eyes wild and completely unfocused. He lunged upward, preparing to vault over the steps and tackle me straight to the ground. But I didn't flinch. I didn't take a single step back. Before Terrence could even place his expensive leather shoe on the second step, two massive men in dark tailored suits stepped out from the shadows near the audiovisual booth. I had specifically requested premium, highly trained security for the event when I paid the hotel deposit, and they moved with terrifying, brutal speed. The first security guard grabbed Terrence by the collar of his custom tuxedo jacket and yanked him backward with incredible physical force. The second guard tackled him hard around the waist, driving his entire body violently into the carpeted floor of the ballroom. Terrence thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities and kicking his legs, but the heavy guards easily pinned him down, pressing his face firmly into the floor. The elegant anniversary party had officially devolved into a chaotic crime scene. Guests scrambled backward, pulling their expensive dresses and tuxedo jackets away from the violent struggle. Samantha stood completely frozen, watching her husband wrestle with hotel security on the ground, the realization finally sinking in that this nightmare was entirely real. I stood calmly on the stage, the microphone still resting easily in my hand, looking down at the absolute wreckage of their lives. Terrence was fully immobilized, his cheek pressed forcefully into the expensive hotel carpet by the heavy hands of my private security detail. Samantha stood frozen a few feet away, her hands hovering near her face in a state of pure shock. Thomas and Brenda were trapped on the stage with me, breathless and pale, utterly stripped of their carefully constructed suburban royalty. The ballroom hung in a suffocating silence, broken only by the ragged, desperate sound of Terrence trying to catch his breath against the floor. Then a loud, sharp noise shattered the quiet. The massive mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the Diamond Ballroom swung open with tremendous force, hitting the brass wall stops with a resounding crack. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Two men in dark tactical windbreakers stepped over the threshold. Across the back of their jackets, the bright yellow letters FBI were printed in bold, unmistakable font. They were flanked by 4 uniformed local police officers, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. They did not look like they were there to attend a luxury anniversary gala. They moved with a chilling, synchronized purpose, heavy boots thudding against the plush carpet, completely indifferent to the opulent floral arrangements and glittering chandeliers overhead. Brenda, still operating under the delusion of her own immense privilege, scrambled to her feet, smoothing down the front of her glittering silver dress, her mind frantically trying to spin the situation. She actually believed the authorities were there to rescue her from the nightmare I had created. She rushed down the stage stairs and ran directly toward the approaching agents, waving her manicured hands in the air. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," Brenda cried out, slipping instantly into her refined, authoritative country club voice. "My daughter is having a severe mental breakdown. She's displaying a fraudulent presentation on those screens, and she hired these thugs to assault my son-in-law. You need to arrest her immediately and clear this room." The lead federal agent didn't even break his stride. He didn't offer her a polite smile or ask for her statement. He looked at her with the cold, detached expression of a man who dealt with real criminals every single day. "Ma'am, step aside right now," he commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. Brenda gasped, deeply offended by his complete lack of deference to her social standing. "But do you not know who we are?" she protested, reaching out to touch his arm. The agent effortlessly stepped around her, leaving her standing entirely alone in the middle of the aisle. The team of officers marched directly to the front of the stage, stopping right where Terrence was pinned to the floor. The lead agent reached into his pocket, pulled out a leather wallet, and flashed a heavy gold badge. He looked at my 2 private security guards and gave a short, sharp nod. "Federal agents," the man stated clearly. "We'll take it from here. Release him." The security guards immediately stepped back, lifting their weight off Terrence. For a brief second, Terrence stayed flat on the floor, breathing heavily, his custom designer tuxedo completely wrinkled and covered in carpet lint. Then 2 of the uniformed officers reached down, grabbed him by the arms, and hauled him roughly to his feet. Terrence looked absolutely wrecked. The arrogant, smooth-talking real estate mogul was entirely gone. His face was flushed and streaked with tears. His nose was running. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting from the officers to his wife, to the audience of wealthy neighbors currently recording the entire ordeal on their cell phones. "Terrence, you are officially under arrest," the lead FBI agent announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. "You are being charged with federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft under United States Code Title 18. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." One of the police officers pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, grabbed Terrence by the wrist, and forced his arm behind his back. The cold metal clicked sharply into place, locking directly next to the brand-new solid gold Rolex Terrence had purchased with my stolen identity just hours prior. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut seemed to break whatever fragile psychological barrier Terrence had left. His knees buckled instantly, If the two officers hadn't been holding him up by the arms, he would have collapsed right back onto the floor. He began to cry loudly, his broad shoulders shaking with heavy, pathetic sobs. "No, please," Terrence begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "You don't understand. I didn't mean to do it. It was a mistake. I have the money. Just let me call the bank. I'll give it all back right now. Please don't put me in jail." "You can't give back money from a frozen account," the FBI agent replied coldly. "Now walk." As the officers turned him toward the exit, Terrence looked over his shoulder and made direct eye contact with my parents, still frozen at the edge of the stage. A dark, desperate realization washed over his tear-stained face. He was going to federal prison, and he was absolutely refusing to go down alone. He had zero loyalty left for the family that had just sheltered him. "Wait!" Terrence screamed, digging the heels of his expensive Italian loafers into the carpet to stop the officers from dragging him away. "Wait. I didn't do it alone. It wasn't just me." The FBI agent paused, raising an eyebrow. "Are you making a statement?" he asked. "Yes," Terrence shouted hysterically, thrusting his chin violently toward Thomas and Brenda. "They made me do it. I just wanted a small loan for a car, but they needed the cash to save this house from foreclosure." Brenda went into the filing cabinet. She gave me the birth certificate. Thomas gave me her social security number. They stood right behind me in the home office and told me exactly how to forge the digital signature. They're the ones who planned the whole thing. Arrest them too. They're part of it. A collective gasp of absolute horror ripped through the wealthy crowd. It was one thing to be broke. It was another thing entirely to throw your own child under the bus to commit federal fraud. Brenda let out a piercing shriek, covering her ears as if the physical act could block out his confession. Thomas went completely rigid, his mouth falling open in sheer terror. "Terrence, shut your mouth right now," Thomas roared, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You lying piece of garbage, how dare you accuse us?" "I did exactly what you told me to do," Terrence sobbed loudly, tears streaming down his face as the officers finally began dragging him down the center aisle. "You said she was just a useless data entry clerk and she'd never find out. You said she owed us. You promised I wouldn't get caught. Tell them the truth, Thomas. Tell them you gave me the number." His voice faded into a pathetic, desperate wail as the heavy mahogany doors closed firmly behind him, shutting him out of the ballroom and out of polite society forever. The FBI agent did not leave with the rest of the officers. Instead, he pulled a small black notepad from his pocket and slowly walked up the stage stairs, his eyes locked entirely on my terrified parents. "Well," the agent said calmly, clicking his pen, "it sounds like we're going to need to add federal conspiracy charges to the file. Thomas and Brenda, you're both going to need to come down to the field office with me right now for formal questioning." The trap hadn't just caught the rat. It had captured the entire infestation. The heavy mahogany doors clicked completely shut, sealing Terrence out of the ballroom and finalizing his descent into the federal justice system. The faint echo of his desperate wails lingered in the hallway for a few seconds before fading into total silence. Inside the Diamond Ballroom, the atmosphere was thick and utterly suffocating. The string quartet had abandoned their instruments entirely. The catering staff stood frozen by the buffet tables. 100 of Atlanta's most elite suburbanites were collectively holding their breath, their cell phones still raised, capturing every single second of the catastrophic downfall of the family that had once reigned supreme over their exclusive country club. Down on the floor, the illusion of the golden child shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Samantha, who had spent her entire adult life parading around in designer clothes and judging everyone she deemed beneath her, finally collapsed. Her knees buckled and she dropped heavily to the carpet, her expensive silk dress bunching up awkwardly around her legs. She did not scream or yell at me this time. She just wept, a deep, guttural sobbing that shook her entire frame. She buried her face in her hands, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her shaking shoulders. The wealthy neighbors she had spent years trying to impress actually took physical steps backward, forming a wide circle of isolation around her. Nobody rushed to comfort her. Nobody offered a handkerchief. She was the wife of a confessed federal criminal, and in their world, that made her completely toxic. On the stage, the reality of the FBI agent's words had finally penetrated the thick layer of arrogance surrounding my parents. The agent did not immediately place them in handcuffs. Instead, he pulled two crisp white business cards from his pocket, handed them to a nearby police officer, and instructed him to escort Thomas and Brenda to the unmarked vehicles waiting by the service exit. The agent gave them exactly 2 minutes to collect themselves while he stepped aside to speak into his shoulder radio. Those 2 minutes were all my parents needed to grasp the absolute, terrifying gravity of their situation. The foreclosure notice was no longer their biggest problem. They were facing federal conspiracy charges. The house, the cars, the country club memberships, none of it mattered if they were sitting in a prison cell. They turned their heads slowly, looking out at the sea of disgusted faces in the audience. They saw the judgment. They saw the cameras recording their humiliation. Their social empire was completely dead. Then their eyes drifted slowly back to me. I was still standing perfectly still under the bright stage lights, the midnight blue silk of my gown practically glowing against the dark background. I held the microphone at my side, my expression completely blank. In that moment, a desperate, frantic calculation crossed my father's face. He realized that the daughter he had spent 33 years calling a pathetic failure was now the most powerful person in the entire room. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar financial holding firm. I had the capital to hire the best defense attorneys in the country. I had the liquid cash to pay off the bank, stop the foreclosure, and somehow make this entire nightmare disappear. The transformation was immediate and grotesque. Thomas and Brenda did not walk toward me. They rushed me, scrambling across the stage like desperate, drowning animals clawing for a life raft. Brenda reached me first. She threw her arms out, her manicured fingers digging violently into the bare skin of my forearm. Her face was streaked with black mascara, her eyes wide and bloodshot with pure terror. "Rebecca, please!" Brenda wailed, her voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual refined polish. "You have to stop this. Tell that agent it was a mistake. Tell him you gave Terrence permission to use the number. We're your family. We're blood. You cannot let them take us away in front of all our friends." Thomas grabbed my other arm, his heavy hands shaking uncontrollably against the expensive fabric of my sleeve. His charismatic posture was entirely broken. He was hunched over, his chest heaving, his face slick with cold sweat. "You have enough money to save us," he pleaded, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper. "You own the company. You can cancel the foreclosure right now. You can pay off the stolen money. Please, Becca, I'm begging you. You cannot let them take our house. You cannot let them destroy our legacy. We will do anything. We will treat you better. Just write the check and make this stop." They clung to my arms, their heavy, panicked breathing filling the space between us. It was the ultimate display of their absolute moral bankruptcy. Even now, facing federal criminal charges and the complete destruction of their lives, their primary concern was keeping their mansion and preserving their fake legacy. They were not apologizing for abusing me. They were not apologizing for stealing my identity. They were only apologizing because they had finally been caught, and they wanted me to buy their way out of the consequences. I looked down at their hands gripping my arms, felt the desperate pressure of their fingers against my skin. For 33 years, I had craved their approval. I had endured their endless insults, their cruel jokes, and their blatant favoritism just to catch a fleeting glimpse of parental affection. I had funded their lavish lifestyle in secret, hoping that keeping them comfortable would somehow bring us peace. But looking at them now, weeping and begging on the stage they had rented to publicly shame me, I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no pity, no lingering sense of daughterly obligation. The emotional cord connecting me to these people had been entirely severed. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached over with my free hand and firmly grabbed my father's thick wrist. With a slow, deliberate, and incredibly cold motion, I peeled his trembling fingers completely off the sleeve of my gown. He gasped, his eyes widening in shock, as I forcefully pushed his hand away. I turned to my mother. She tried to tighten her grip on my forearm, her sharp nails digging into my skin, but I showed her the exact same complete lack of mercy. I grabbed her hand, twisted it sharply, and shoved it away, stepping back so they were both completely disconnected from me. They stumbled slightly, their hands falling uselessly to their sides. They stared at me, their faces twisted in absolute disbelief. They could not comprehend that the quiet, submissive girl they had bullied for decades was standing her ground, completely unaffected by their ultimate begging. They had expected me to cave under the pressure of the word family, but they had fundamentally forgotten that they were the ones who taught me that family meant absolutely nothing when money was on the line. I stepped back, creating a deliberate physical distance between myself and the two people who had brought me into this world. Thomas and Brenda stood there, arms hanging limply at their sides, staring at me with hollow, desperate eyes. They looked like strangers. The polished, arrogant couple that had confidently taken the stage just 20 minutes earlier was entirely gone. In their place stood two terrified, broken frauds who had finally run out of other people's money to spend. The lead FBI agent stood patiently at the bottom of the stage stairs. He did not rush me. He crossed his arms over his tactical windbreaker, watching the scene unfold with a quiet, observant respect. He knew I was the victim in this massive federal case, and he was giving me the floor to deliver my final verdict before he hauled them off to a cold interrogation room. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. 100 wealthy socialites, the very people my parents had worshipped and sacrificed their own daughter to impress, stood frozen among the scattered dining tables, waiting for my next move. I raised the microphone back to my lips. My hand was perfectly steady. My voice, when it echoed through the massive diamond ballroom, was devoid of any anger, sorrow, or hesitation. It was the cold, clinical voice of a chief executive officer terminating a deeply toxic contract. "You spent my entire life telling me exactly what I was," I said, looking directly into my father's pale, sweating face. "You made sure I knew my place in this family. When I was a child, you told me I was a disappointment. When I became an adult, you told me I was a burden. You invited all your high society friends to this lavish party tonight, and you stood behind that acrylic podium and told them all that you had to carry the dead weight of those who contribute absolutely nothing to the family empire." Thomas shook his head weakly, a fresh wave of panicked tears spilling over his cheeks. "No, Rebecca," he croaked, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "I didn't mean it. I was just talking. We were just trying to look successful for the board members. We're your parents. You know we love you." I ignored his pathetic begging and turned my cold gaze to my mother. She was shivering in her expensive silver dress, her makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her face, ruining her perfect facade. "And you," I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a razor, "stood in the custom kitchen of a house I secretly paid for, drinking premium champagne I bought, and looked right into a camera and called me a pathetic failure. You said I was absolutely useless. You called me a parasite who infected this family with a poverty mindset. You both decided that my only value in this world was my pristine credit score, which you happily handed over to a con artist to save your precious country club memberships." Brenda let out a sharp, breathless sob, burying her face in her trembling hands. I let the weight of their own cruel words hang in the air for a long moment, making sure every single guest in the room absorbed the absolute depravity of their actions. I looked at the giant LED screens behind me, still displaying the irrefutable digital proof of their federal crimes, then back at my parents. "For 33 years, I've fought to prove you wrong," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "I hid my massive success because I wanted you to love me for me, not for my bank account. I paid your bills in secret because I wanted to save you from your own reckless greed. I kept trying to be the good daughter, hoping that one day you would look at me with the same pride and adoration you reserved for Terrence and Samantha. But I am entirely done fighting. I am done trying to prove my worth to people who possess absolutely none." I paused, taking one final deep breath of the crisp hotel air. "You called me a pathetic failure," I stated clearly, the microphone picking up every crisp syllable. "You said I was a parasite. Well, I've thought about it, and I'm simply agreeing with you." Thomas gasped loudly, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as the true meaning of my words washed over him. "I'm accepting the exact role you gave me," I continued, my voice echoing like thunder across the room. "A useless failure doesn't have the means to pay off $1 million mortgage. A parasite doesn't have the capital to fund a high-powered federal criminal defense team. So from this exact moment on, you will never see another dime from me. My corporate accounts are permanently sealed to you. My personal phone number is disconnected. The leniency period is officially over. The foreclosure on your home proceeds tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp." "No!" Brenda shrieked, collapsing back onto her knees and grabbing handfuls of her own hair. "Rebecca, no. You cannot do this to us. The bank will take everything. Where will we go? What will we do?" I looked down at her, feeling a profound, beautiful sense of closure. "You can do whatever you want, Mother," I replied softly, "but you'll do it without me." I reached over to the clear acrylic podium and set the microphone down gently on its surface. The heavy thud of metal against plastic signaled the absolute end of the conversation. I did not wait for the FBI agent to walk up the stairs. I did not wait to watch the local police put my parents in heavy steel handcuffs. I simply turned my back on them forever. I walked to the edge of the stage and gracefully descended the carpeted steps, my midnight blue silk gown gliding effortlessly behind me. As I stepped onto the ballroom floor, something remarkable happened. The dense crowd of wealthy neighbors, country club presidents, and local socialites immediately parted. They stepped back, clearing a wide, unobstructed path directly to the mahogany exit doors. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody offered a single word of criticism or judgment. They looked at me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. As I walked down the makeshift aisle, the suffocating silence of the room finally broke, not with sympathy for my parents, but with the vicious, buzzing sound of high society gossip. The very people my parents had bankrupted themselves to impress were now turning on them like a pack of starving wolves. I could hear the harsh whispers echoing through the crowd. I heard a prominent neighborhood association board member mention calling an emergency meeting to expedite their removal from the subdivision. I heard another wealthy guest laughing cruelly about Terrence and his fake luxury portfolio. I glanced over my shoulder one last time before reaching the grand doors. The stage was a picture of absolute devastation. The federal agents had finally moved in, officially reading Thomas and Brenda their Miranda rights while they sobbed hysterically on the floor. Down in the crowd, guests held their smartphones high in the air, recording every miserable second of my parents being publicly humiliated and escorted away in total disgrace. The bright flashes of their phone cameras illuminated the dark ballroom, capturing the total, undeniable collapse of their fake empire. I turned forward, pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, and walked out into the cool, quiet hallway of the hotel lobby. I left them behind to face the absolute ruin of their own making and stepped confidently into a bright future that was, finally, entirely mine. 3 months passed since the night of the anniversary party, and the dust finally settled over the absolute wreckage of their lives. I kept my promise to the exact minute. At 9 o'clock the morning after the disastrous gala, the legal division of Apex Holdings officially executed the final foreclosure documents. There were no extensions, no grace periods, and absolutely no secret bailouts. The sprawling $1.2 million suburban home, the ultimate symbol of my parents' fake success, was seized and immediately put up for public auction. It sold in under 20 minutes to a corporate developer who planned to gut the entire interior. The eviction process was swift and entirely merciless. I wasn't there to see it, but Aunt Carol told me that 2 county sheriff's deputies arrived at the property to physically escort Thomas and Brenda off the premises. They were forced to pack whatever clothes they could fit into black plastic trash bags, while the same wealthy neighbors they had once tried to impress watched the entire humiliating spectacle from their perfectly manicured lawns. Today, my parents are living a reality they once considered a fate worse than death. With their credit completely destroyed and a pending federal conspiracy indictment hanging over their heads, no reputable management company would rent to them. They were forced into a cramped, aggressively moldy one-bedroom apartment on the far, bad side of town, right next to a noisy industrial park. The elegant scent of Brenda's signature designer perfume has been entirely replaced by the permanent stench of damp mildew, cheap cooking oil, and stale cigarette smoke seeping through the thin, peeling walls. There are no crystal chandeliers or marble countertops. Brenda spends her days sitting on a heavily stained second-hand sofa, drinking cheap instant coffee from a chipped mug, staring blankly at a small television bought at a pawn shop. Thomas is a completely broken man. His charismatic country club persona evaporated the second his bank accounts were frozen. He spends his afternoons desperately scrolling through his phone, trying to reach former golf buddies and business associates to beg for personal loans or legal favors. Every single one of them has blocked his number. The Oakmont Valley Country Club formally revoked their membership the morning after the FBI raided the anniversary party, issuing a highly public ban. My parents are absolute pariahs now. They cannot walk into a grocery store or a local pharmacy in their old neighborhood without people pointing, whispering, and quickly walking in the opposite direction. The crushing weight of their mounting legal fees has completely drowned them. They are trapped in a miserable, squalid little box, spending every waking moment blaming each other for the sheer greed that destroyed their lives. Samantha suffered an equally spectacular fall from grace. The moment Terrence was arrested, the federal government immediately froze all of their joint checking and savings accounts pending the fraud investigation. She lost access to the stolen money, the credit cards, and the luxury lifestyle she had built her entire identity around. Without the phantom income to support her, she was evicted from her high-end downtown rental within 4 weeks. She tried to move in with Thomas and Brenda, but their tiny, moldy apartment simply didn't have the space, and the screaming matches between the 3 of them became so violent that the landlord threatened to call the police. To survive, the golden child was forced to do something she had actively avoided her entire adult life. She had to get a real job. Samantha now works the grueling overnight shift as a cashier at a massive 24-hour discount retail chain. The girl who used to mock my thrift store winter coats and brag about handing down her designer dresses is now forced to wear a stiff, cheap polyester uniform vest over a faded polo shirt. She stands on her feet for 9 hours straight under harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, scanning discounted groceries and cheap household goods for minimum wage. Her once perfect blonde hair is constantly tied back in a messy, exhausted ponytail, and her manicured nails are chipped and broken from breaking down cardboard boxes in the stockroom. Last week, Aunt Carol heard that two of Samantha's former wealthy friends from the Homeowners Association walked into the store late at night to buy emergency cold medicine. They walked right up to Samantha's register. They didn't say a word to her. They just looked at her cheap uniform, paid for their items, and offered her a look of devastating, absolute pity before walking out. Samantha cried in the employee break room for the rest of her shift. And then there is Terrence. The arrogant, fast-talking, fake real estate mogul did not get to return to his tailored suits or his high-end luxury vehicles because he was facing serious federal charges and had actively demonstrated a willingness to commit wire fraud across state lines. The judge deemed him a severe flight risk and denied him bail. For the past 3 months, Terrence has been sitting inside a bleak, maximum security federal detention center, awaiting his official trial. His massive fake empire has been reduced to an 8x10 concrete cell, a thin mattress on a metal cot, and a bright orange jumpsuit. The man who once wore a solid gold Rolex and bragged about closing million-dollar deals now has to ask a heavily armed guard for permission to use the bathroom. His court-appointed public defender has already told him that the physical evidence provided by Apex Holdings, including the IP address tracking log and the forged electronic signatures, is absolutely bulletproof. The federal prosecutors are not offering any lenient plea deals. They are pushing for the maximum sentence. Terrence is currently facing 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. According to recorded prison phone calls obtained by the legal team, Terrence spends his allotted 15 minutes of phone time sobbing to anyone who will accept the collect call, violently blaming Samantha and my parents for forcing him to steal my identity. They are all trapped in their own personal hells now. They have lost their homes, their freedom, their reputations, and, in some cases, their sanity. They turned on each other the second the money dried up, proving that their supposed family loyalty was never anything more than a transactional illusion. They gambled everything they had on the assumption that I was too weak to fight back, and they lost absolutely everything in the process. I stood leaning against the thick glass railing of my newly purchased penthouse balcony, letting the warm morning sun wash over my face. The sprawling Atlanta skyline stretched out in front of me, a breathtaking sea of towering glass and steel glittering in the early light. The air up here was clean and quiet, completely removed from the noise and chaos of the streets below. For 5 years, I had confined myself to a tiny, dimly lit apartment with cracked linoleum floors and peeling paint, playing the role of the impoverished data entry clerk to keep my toxic family at bay. But that chapter of my life was permanently closed. I was finally allowing myself to enjoy the fruits of my own relentless hard work. The penthouse was a physical manifestation of my freedom, expansive, beautifully designed, and, most importantly, paid for entirely in cash. There were no hidden loans, no secret corporate guarantors, and absolutely no strings attached. I turned around and looked back into the massive, open-concept living room. Aunt Carol was sitting comfortably on a plush, cream-colored sofa, her feet tucked beneath a soft cashmere throw blanket, holding a steaming mug of premium dark roast coffee, completely engrossed in a novel she'd just bought. She looked peaceful, completely unburdened by the relentless drama that had consumed the rest of her relatives. When the federal investigation tore through my parents' lives, Aunt Carol had been the only one who stood her ground, refusing to lie for them or cover up their crimes. She had proven that true family loyalty was never about enabling toxic behavior, but about standing up for what was right. I had moved her into the guest suite of the penthouse the previous month, ensuring she would never have to worry about her own retirement or rely on the charity of people like Thomas and Brenda. She looked up from her book, caught me watching her, and offered a warm, genuine smile. There was no hidden agenda in her expression, no silent calculation about what she could extract from me. It was simply pure, unconditional love. Earlier that morning, I'd received a secure email from the federal bank fraud investigator I had worked with. He wanted to personally inform me that Terrence had formally accepted a binding plea agreement to avoid a prolonged public trial. He had admitted to all charges of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. In exchange for his full cooperation, the federal prosecutors reduced the maximum penalty down to a guaranteed 7 years in federal prison, followed by a decade of heavily supervised probation. The email also confirmed that Thomas and Brenda had been officially indicted on felony conspiracy charges. They had surrendered their passports and were currently awaiting trial, trapped in that miserable, moldy apartment on the bad side of town. The legal loop was completely closed. The threat they posed was permanently neutralized. They would spend the rest of their natural lives paying for the massive deceit they had orchestrated, completely isolated from the luxury world they once ruled. Aunt Carol set her book down on the glass coffee table and walked out onto the balcony to join me. She leaned against the railing, taking a deep breath of the fresh morning air. "It's incredibly quiet up here," she said softly, her eyes scanning the distant horizon. I nodded, agreeing with her completely. "It's the best kind of quiet," I replied. Aunt Carol looked at me, her expression turning serious for a brief moment. "You did the right thing, Rebecca," she told me, her voice filled with absolute certainty. "You gave them every chance to be a real family. You protected them when they didn't deserve it, and they repaid you with the ultimate betrayal. Don't ever let anyone make you feel guilty for finally choosing yourself." I listened to her words, letting them sink deep into my heart. She was absolutely right. There was zero guilt left in my system. The journey from being the family scapegoat to standing on this balcony had been incredibly painful, but it had been entirely necessary. For decades, society had conditioned me to believe that blood ties were an unbreakable contract, that we're taught to forgive and forget, to turn the other cheek, and to constantly make excuses for the people who share our DNA. But the brutal reality is that blood does not excuse abuse. Sharing a last name does not give anyone the right to systematically destroy your mental health or steal your identity. My parents and my sister had weaponized the very concept of family to drain me dry. They had demanded respect while offering absolutely none in return. I realized that financial independence is the ultimate shield against toxic people. Money cannot buy happiness, but it absolutely buys freedom. It buys the ability to walk away from a dinner table where you're being disrespected. It buys the power to hire elite legal counsel when someone tries to frame you for a federal crime. It buys the absolute security of knowing you will never have to depend on someone who actively wants to see you fail. By building Apex Holdings in secret, I had constructed an impenetrable fortress around myself. When they finally tried to strike their lethal blow, their weapons shattered against the walls I had built. I did not just survive their betrayal, I orchestrated their absolute downfall using the very system they had tried to manipulate. The air felt lighter now. The heavy, suffocating weight of my parents' expectations was completely gone. I no longer had to monitor my speech, hide my nice things, or pretend to be less than I was just to make them feel comfortable in their own mediocrity. Apex Holdings was expanding into new corporate territories. My personal portfolio was thriving, and I was finally, completely living in the light. The fear that had defined my early 20s was replaced by a cold, unyielding confidence. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly what I was capable of achieving. The pathetic failure they had mocked in that Thanksgiving video was nothing but a ghost now. Sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to buy the board and kick the players off. Have you ever had to use the law to cut off toxic family members? Let me know your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of sweet justice.